Everyone remembers SpongeBob as the happiest show ever made for kids. A sponge who loves his job, a goofy best friend, a pineapple under the sea. Pure joy, nothing hidden underneath. Then, a suicide attempt showed up in an actual episode, and Mr. Krabs laughed at it. In this video, we're breaking down the dark side of SpongeBob, the two real bands, midlife crustacean and quarantined crab. Every long-running cartoon builds up a pile of internet rumors about episodes that got pulled, episodes that got banned, episodes that some parent complained about until a network folded. Most of those stories turn out to be nothing. A kid remembers a scene wrong, someone posts about it online, and within a year, the internet treats a false memory like documented history. SpongeBob SquarePants has more of these rumors floating around than almost any other kids show ever made. Underneath all the noise, there are exactly 2 episodes where Nickelodeon actually made a real, confirmed decision to stop airing something. Not a rumor, not a forum post, an actual choice made by actual people at the network for reasons they eventually explained out loud. Those 2 episodes are Midlife Crustacean and Quarantined Crab. One of them has been gone for years and shows no sign of coming back. The other one disappeared for a while and then quietly returned. Looking at both of them side by side tells you something real about where the line sits for a kids show that spent over 2 decades getting away with almost everything. Midlife Crustacean aired back in 2003 during the show's 3rd season, one of its strongest stretches by most fan accounts. The plot sounds harmless on paper. Mr. Krabs is going through a midlife crisis, feeling old and left behind. SpongeBob and Patrick decide the fix is a big night out to help their boss feel young again. The night starts out goofy, with a stop at a kid's arcade that embarrasses Krabs rather than entertains him. Patrick then tells him there is something better waiting, something that will really make him feel like a wild young crab again. He calls it a panty raid. A panty raid was a real thing that happened on American college campuses decades ago, mostly between the 1940s and 1960s, where groups of young men would sneak into women's dormitories and steal underwear as a prank. It was already a dated and uncomfortable idea by the early 2000s, and putting it into a cartoon aimed at children made it land very differently than the writers likely expected. In the episode, the 3 of them break into a house that does not belong to any of them and steal underwear belonging to a woman none of them know. The reveal that this stranger turns out to be Mr. Krabs' own mother is meant to soften the joke. By the time that reveal lands, though, the episode has already spent several minutes on a break-in and a theft, and the punchline does not erase that. For 15 years, the episode kept running in reruns without much fuss. Then, in 2018, Nickelodeon pulled it completely. A network representative told the entertainment outlet IGN that a standards review had determined some story elements were no longer appropriate for children, a plain way of confirming the panty raid plot did not belong in a kids show. Since that decision, Midlife Crustacean has not aired on Nickelodeon and is not on the streaming platforms that carry the rest of the library. It briefly and accidentally appeared on Paramount Plus in 2023, described at the time as a technical error, and was pulled again almost immediately. The United States was not even first to act on this episode. British broadcasters had already banned it around 2008 or 2009, nearly a decade before the American ban. 2 separate broadcasting systems, working independently and years apart, landed on the same conclusion, which suggests the problem was never just one overly cautious network. Nickelodeon has aired plenty of jokes over the years about violence and death that clearly were not written with a 7-year-old in mind, and almost none of those get removed. Midlife Crustacean stands alone as the one episode treated as something to erase, rather than quietly leave in rotation. There are no plans to bring it back, and it has not appeared on any DVD release since the ban began. The second confirmed ban tells a very different kind of story, shaped by something nobody at Nickelodeon could have planned for. Quarantined Crab came from the show's 12th season, built around a simple premise. A mysterious illness called the clam flu spreads through Bikini Bottom. A health inspector places the Krusty Krab under quarantine, and the cast ends up stuck inside together. Trapping characters in one location is one of the oldest tricks in sitcom writing. There is no violence and nothing close to the content that got Midlife Crustacean pulled. The entire problem here was timing. The episode had been scheduled to air in 2020, the exact year the real world experienced a global pandemic with actual quarantines and actual lockdowns. An episode about a restaurant under quarantine stopped looking like a lighthearted plot and started looking like something that might upset an audience audience living through the real version of it. Nickelodeon held the episode back rather than air it, telling IGN directly that, given the sensitivities around the real pandemic, the decision was made not to air a storyline centered on a virus. This was never a judgment that the content itself was inappropriate, the way it had been with the Panty Raid episode. It was bad timing turning an ordinary episode into something the network did not want in front of viewers dealing with real quarantine fear. The episode did not disappear everywhere. It aired first internationally, starting in France in May of 2020, while the American version was still being held back, which shows this was about timing in specific markets rather than the episode being treated as dangerous. The wait in the United States stretched to the spring of 2022, roughly 2 years after the original air date. By then, plenty of other shows had already returned from pandemic-related delays, and some had even folded pandemic storylines into their own writing. The world had shifted enough that the episode no longer carried the same weight. Once it aired, Quarantined Crab returned to normal rotation on Paramount+. It still has not appeared on any physical DVD release, even years later, while every other episode from that stretch has made it onto disc at some point, suggesting some lingering caution even now. Putting these two bands side by side says something worth sitting with. Midlife Crustacean was pulled over what happens inside the story itself, a plot built around theft and privacy violation that does not become less uncomfortable with time. Quarantined Crab was never a problem of content. It was a problem of collision, an ordinary plot running into a real crisis that made the same jokes land differently for a couple of years. Once that collision faded, the episode went right back to being an unremarkable mid-season entry. Together, these two bands prove that Nickelodeon has drawn a real line somewhere, even for a show that has spent over 2 decades getting away with almost everything. It takes something specific to cross from uncomfortable into actually removed. A joke built around invading someone's privacy did it. A plot that accidentally mirrored a real global tragedy did it too, at least for a while. Everything else fans love to call banned, and there is a long list of episodes people online insist got pulled for one dramatic reason or another, has kept airing without any official confirmation a ban ever happened. Once you separate these two confirmed bans from the pile of internet rumor, a much clearer picture forms of what this show's actual darkest material looks like. And one of those rumored episodes centers on the single most disturbing scene the show has ever produced. One built around a side character being pushed toward taking his own life, while a main character simply laughs. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One of those rumored episodes involves a plot that people insist was pulled from broadcast entirely, built around a story so uncomfortable that fans still argue about whether the removal was ever officially confirmed or whether it just quietly stopped airing on its own. That episode centers on one of the show's most disturbing single scenes ever produced, a moment involving a side character being pushed toward taking his own life, while one of the show's main characters simply laughs. Section 2. One Course Meal. The episode built around Plankton's suicide attempt. Every kids show has episodes that did not land well. Jokes that felt a little too mean, plots that dragged, moments that made parents raise an eyebrow. Most of those moments fade into the background of a long-running series, and nobody remembers them a decade later. One Course Meal is not one of those episodes. Out of every single episode SpongeBob SquarePants has ever produced, across more than 2 decades, this is the one that shows up again and again on lists of the worst, the darkest, and the most upsetting thing the show ever put on screen. And unlike a lot of fan arguments about which episode is the meanest or the most disturbing, this one has an actual reason behind the reputation that anyone can point to directly. The episode comes from season 7, and it centers on the long-running rivalry between Mr. Krabs and his tiny green nemesis, Plankton. Their fight over the secret formula for Krabby Patties has been the engine behind dozens of episodes throughout the show's history, almost always played completely for laughs. Plankton tries some scheme to steal the formula. The scheme fails in some ridiculous way, and everyone moves on until the next episode brings the same setup back around. That formula had worked fine for years. One Course Meal took the exact same rivalry and turned it into something built entirely around cruelty. The plot starts when Krabs discovers, almost by accident, that Plankton has an intense and specific fear of whales. Once he learns this, Krabs does not let it go. He puts on a costume made to look like his own daughter Pearl, who happens to be a whale, and uses that disguise to terrify Plankton over over and over again. This is not a single prank played once for a quick laugh. The episode stretches this out across what the story describes as 16 straight days, with Krabs returning again and again in disguise to frighten an increasingly desperate and unstable Plankton. The toll this takes on Plankton is shown directly rather than implied. He starts having nightmares about being swallowed by whales, imagining his own extended family trapped inside one along with him. He becomes paranoid, jumpy, and increasingly unable to function. His wife Karen, the computer he is usually shown interacting with, does not believe what he is telling her about being tormented, which leaves him completely alone with what he is going through. SpongeBob, who normally exists as the emotional center of the show and rarely takes anything this seriously, actually notices what is happening and tries to step in, which tells you the writers themselves understood something had shifted from ordinary cartoon mischief into something heavier. The moment that defines the entire episode, and the reason it still gets brought up more than a decade after it aired, comes near the end of this stretch of torment. Plankton, worn down completely by weeks of fear and isolation, walks out into the street and lies down in front of an oncoming bus. He tells SpongeBob directly that he intends to end his life this way, and he even asks SpongeBob to step on him to make sure it happens. SpongeBob's response is not alarm or an attempt to talk him out of it. He simply says that stepping on him would go against his good nature, and the moment passes without anyone treating it as the emergency it actually is. When SpongeBob later goes and tells Mr. Krabs that Plankton is lying in the street in this state, Krabs does not react with concern either. His response, word for word as written in the episode, is a laugh, followed by the comment that Plankton is a mess. That single line, delivered as a punchline rather than a moment of guilt or realization, is the piece of the episode that critics, fans, and parents groups have pointed to more than anything else over the years. A character in visible crisis, having just attempted to take his own life, is met with laughter from the person who caused the crisis in the first place, and the show moves on without ever circling back to address it. The episode does eventually give Plankton something resembling payback. Once he learns that Pearl was never actually the one tormenting him, and realizes Krabs had been behind the disguise the entire time, he gets a small moment of revenge, using Krabs' own fear of mimes against him. But this brief moment does not undo what came before it. SpongeBob ultimately scares Plankton off again near the very end, using a hologram projector, meaning the episode closes with Plankton losing yet again, right after the show has spent most of its runtime putting him through a mental breakdown that included an actual suicide attempt. Critics and fans reacted to this episode with a level of consistency that is rare for internet opinion on anything. Review sites and longtime fan communities that usually argue endlessly about which episodes are good or bad found unusual agreement here. Multiple ranking lists, including ones compiled by long-running review channels dedicated to breaking down animated shows episode by episode, placed one course meal at or near the very top of their worst episode rankings. On the review aggregator IMDb, the episode holds one of the lowest user ratings of any episode in the show's entire history, sitting just above the single lowest rated episode the series has ever produced. The criticism did not stay confined to fan forums and review sites. A petition was created on the website change.org, specifically asking Nickelodeon to stop airing this particular episode. The text of that petition laid out the concern in plain terms, pointing directly at the suicide attempt scene and the line of dialogue where Krabs laughs it off, arguing that suicide is a serious real-world issue and has no place being treated as a punchline in a show made for children. The petition specifically noted that there are real people in the world who have attempted the exact method shown in the episode, which is part of what made the joke land so badly for so many viewers watching it as adults, rather than as kids who might not fully register what was happening on screen. Beyond the organized criticism, the episode became something of a case study among people who study or write about children's animation, specifically around the question of what dark cartoon humor can get away with and where the line actually sits. Writers covering the episode have pointed out that SpongeBob had used dark or morbid humor plenty of times before without generating this kind of backlash, and the difference usually comes down to how directly a joke engages with something real. A quick visual gag referencing danger and moving on immediately is very different from a sustained multi-day storyline that ends in a character stating stating outright that he intends to end his life, followed by another character laughing about it. The episode's reputation grew large enough that it spilled over into fanfiction and internet horror writing as well. A piece of user-created horror fiction called Plankton Got Served was written specifically based on this episode, imagining a version of the story where Plankton's suicide attempt actually succeeds, followed by him waking up in some kind of afterlife setting. Stories like this, sometimes referred to as creepypasta, tend to get written about media that already carries a disturbing weight to it, and the fact that this particular episode inspired one says something about how deeply it settled into the darker corners of the show's internet fan culture. It is worth being clear about what this episode is and is not, because it would be easy to overstate things in the other direction. Plankton does not die in the actual aired episode. His attempt is interrupted, not completed, and the show returns him to his usual scheming personality by the next episode. The way this kind of show almost always resets its characters, no matter what happened the episode before. There is no indication anywhere that the writers intended for viewers, especially young viewers, to walk away from the episode thinking about suicide in any serious or reflective way. Everything about the pacing and the tone suggests the writers believed they were making something dark but still comedic, in line with plenty of morbid jokes the show had gotten away with in earlier seasons. What makes this episode different from those earlier jokes is not intent, it is execution. A quick sight gag lasts a couple of seconds and moves on, before anyone has time to sit with it. This episode spends its entire second half building toward a moment where a specific character says specific words about wanting to die, using a method that is realistic rather than cartoonish, and pairs that moment with another character laughing directly afterward instead of showing any concern. Multiple people who have written about the episode over the years have pointed out that the difference between an implied dark joke and a stated one changes how an audience processes it. Even a young audience that might not consciously register what has happened, but still absorbs the framing that someone in crisis can be treated as a punchline. The episode also stands out because of who ends up looking worst by the time the credits roll. Mr. Krabs is usually written as greedy and occasionally selfish, but almost always in a way the show treats as harmless, the kind of personality flaw that gets him into trouble and then gets resolved by the end of 22 minutes. In this episode, he spends more than 2 weeks deliberately terrorizing someone using a phobia he discovered by accident, shows no guilt about the damage this causes, and reacts to news of an attempted suicide with laughter. Multiple critical write-ups over the years have specifically flagged this episode as the moment where Krabs stopped feeling like a lovable cartoon miser and started feeling like something closer to a bully without limits, a shift that a lot of longtime viewers traced directly back to this single half hour of television. This matters beyond just this one episode, because it points toward a pattern that shows up again later in the show's run. Krabs being written as cruel without consequence did not start and stop here. It reappears in other episodes further along in the series, in ways that generated their own separate wave of criticism, some of it just as loud as what followed this one. The specific target of his cruelty changes from episode to episode, but the shape of it, someone in his life suffering while he either causes it directly or benefits from it without caring, keeps returning as the show moves into its later seasons. One of the clearest examples of that pattern comes from an episode that does not involve Plankton at all, and does not involve any fear of whales or disguises. Instead, it puts SpongeBob himself on the receiving end, in a storyline that pulled the show directly into a real national news conversation happening at the exact same time the episode aired, over an issue that had nothing to do with cartoons at all. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. If you or someone you know is struggling with thoughts of suicide, this is a heavy topic worth taking seriously, and reaching out to a trusted person or a crisis support line can make a real difference. Section 3. SpongeBob You're Fired, the episode that accidentally became a news story. Most controversies around SpongeBob SquarePants happen inside the world of the show itself. A joke goes too far, a scene gets too dark, and the backlash stays contained to fans, critics, and the occasional petition. SpongeBob You're Fired is different. This episode did something almost no other entry in the show's history managed to do. It walked straight into an actual, real-world political argument happening on the news at the exact same time it aired, and it did this completely by accident, through one single line of dialogue that nobody involved in making the episode seemed to expect suspect would cause any trouble at all. The episode comes from season 9 and originally aired in November of 2013. By this point in the show's run, SpongeBob had already been fired from the Krusty Krab twice before, in earlier episodes called Karate Choppers and Squid on Strike. Getting fired and rehired was already a familiar plot device the writers had used more than once. This time, the reason behind the firing had nothing to do with SpongeBob doing anything wrong. Mr. Krabs realizes he can save a single nickel by cutting SpongeBob's salary down to nothing, and he decides that small amount of money is worth ending SpongeBob's job over entirely. The firing scene itself is treated with more emotional weight than the earlier 2 times this happened in the show's history. Krabs hands SpongeBob a pink slip, along with a can and an axe, symbolic props meant to represent being let go. SpongeBob reacts with complete devastation, crying so hard that his tears form an actual flood inside the restaurant, deep enough that Squidward has to wheel him out on a cart just to get him out the door. Squidward, never known for being kind to SpongeBob, adds one more insult on the way out, telling him he can come back anytime he likes, just not as an employee, only as a paying customer. That line sends SpongeBob into another wave of crying before Squidward shuts the blinds and gets back to work like nothing happened. Squidward actually asks Krabs if he can be fired too, hoping to get out of work himself, but Krabs refuses him because Squidward has been there longer and technically has seniority. SpongeBob, desperate to keep his job in any form, even offers to work for free. Krabs tells him he already looked into that option and found out it is against the law, and doing it anyway would cost him his license to run the restaurant at all. There is no way around it. SpongeBob is out of a job, and the show spends real time letting that sink in, rather than rushing past it the way earlier firing episodes had. Once SpongeBob gets home, the episode shifts into showing what unemployment actually looks like for him day to day. He tells Gary the news, breaks down crying again, and Patrick, upon hearing his best friend cry, immediately starts crying along with him, without even understanding what happened yet. When SpongeBob finally explains the situation, Patrick's reaction becomes the center of the episode's whole second act. Patrick tells him that being unemployed is actually the best situation anyone could ask for. He calls it fun employment, and promises to show SpongeBob exactly how good life can be without a job the very next day. The next morning, SpongeBob opens his door looking noticeably worn down, unshaven, and disheveled in a way the show clearly intends viewers to read as a sign of how badly the firing has affected him emotionally. Patrick shows up anyway, energetic and ready to walk him through what he calls the 3 steps of glorious unemployment. Those steps include eating breakfast out of Squidward's garden without permission, taking a long nap on Patrick's favorite rock, and getting a free lunch by taking part in one of Sandy's scientific experiments, which in this case involves eating a substance that appears to be some kind of toxic waste in exchange for food. This is the point in the episode where the line that caused all the trouble finally shows up. SpongeBob looks at everything Patrick is showing him, all these ways to get by without holding down a job, and responds by saying that unemployment might be fun for Patrick, but he personally needs to find work. On its own, in the context of the scene, this line reads as a fairly simple character moment. SpongeBob has always been defined by loving his job more than almost anything else in his life, so of course he wants to get back to work, rather than settle into a life of napping and stealing vegetables from Squidward's yard. The writers almost certainly intended this line as nothing more than a reminder of who SpongeBob is as a character. That is not how a large number of viewers, and more importantly, a number of news outlets and political commentators chose to read it. Once the episode aired, the line started getting interpreted as a message about real-world unemployment benefits, specifically the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, more commonly known as food stamps. Critics who took this reading argued that Patrick's entire fun employment sequence, especially the part where he gets a free meal through Sandy's experiment, functioned as a stand-in for government assistance programs, and that SpongeBob rejecting this lifestyle in favor of hunting down a job was the show quietly telling kids that people who use these programs are lazy or taking the easy way out instead of working. This reading spread fast enough that it stopped being just an internet argument and became actual news coverage. The media watchdog organization, Media Matters for America, picked up the story and reported on it directly, treating the episode as a piece of political messaging aimed at a children's audience. From there, the story reached television. MSNBC host Al Sharpton addressed the episode on air, using his platform to push back on what he saw as an unfair and inaccurate portrayal of people who rely on public assistance programs to get by. Having a sitting cable news host spend airtime responding to a SpongeBob SquarePants episode is not something that happens often, and it tells you how far this single line traveled beyond its original context inside a 22-minute cartoon. It is worth being fair to the other side of this argument as well, since plenty of people at the time, and in the years since, have pushed back on the idea that the episode was making any kind of political statement at all. The most common counter-argument points out that SpongeBob has been established as someone who loves his job since the very first episode of the entire series, long before this specific storyline was ever written. His entire personality is built around wanting to work, wanting to please his boss, and finding genuine joy in flipping patties at the Krusty Krab. Under this reading, the line about needing a job is not a comment on anyone's real-life circumstances. It is simply consistent with 15 years of established character behavior, and reading anything more political into it requires assuming intent that the writers likely never had. Nickelodeon itself never publicly confirmed that the episode contained any intended political message. A network executive named Russell Hicks, speaking generally about the episode rather than addressing the controversy point by point, said the show has always found success by tapping into whatever is happening in the culture at a given moment while still keeping things funny for its audience, and that despite this temporary setback for the character, SpongeBob's endless optimism always wins out in the end. That statement reads as a fairly careful, non-committal response, acknowledging the show pulls from real-world topics without directly admitting the episode was trying to say anything specific about unemployment benefits. Separate from the political controversy, the episode also picked up a reputation among longtime fans and critics as one of the weakest entries in the show's entire run, for reasons that have nothing to do with the food stamp discussion at all. On the review site IMDb, the episode holds a rating around 4.4 out of 10, placing it among the lowest rated episodes the show has ever produced across its full run. Fan communities and long-running animation review channels have pointed to a long list of separate problems with the episode that exist completely apart from the political reading. One frequent complaint is that the entire premise felt recycled. SpongeBob getting fired had already been the plot of 2 earlier episodes, Karate Choppers and Squid on Strike, and viewers pointed out that reusing this exact setup a third time, as a longer double-length special no less, made the story feel like it was repeating old ground rather than doing anything new with the characters. Several individual scenes within the episode were also called out as being lifted from earlier episodes, almost beat for beat. SpongeBob crying uncontrollably had already been the entire plot of an earlier episode called A Day Without Tears. SpongeBob struggling to cook food other than Krabby Patties had already appeared in an episode called Le Big Switch. SpongeBob searching for a new job had already been covered in an episode called Model Sponge. Critics who noticed all these overlaps argued that SpongeBob You're Fired was less an original story and more a highlight reel of ideas the show had already done, stretched out to fill a longer runtime. The pacing of the episode drew criticism as well. Multiple scenes were pointed out as dragging on far longer than they needed to, without actually moving the plot forward. The opening montage, showing SpongeBob happily at work before the firing, takes up a significant chunk of time without establishing anything new, since longtime viewers already know exactly how SpongeBob behaves at his job from years of earlier episodes. The scene where SpongeBob tries to tell Patrick he got fired also gets stretched out through a long back and forth where Patrick keeps trying to guess foods that start with the letter F, mistakenly thinking SpongeBob is trying to get him to guess words that start with C. Reviewers describe sequences like this as padding, material that exists mainly to stretch the episode's runtime rather than to develop the story or the characters in any meaningful way. Character behavior in the episode also drew specific criticism, separate from the political reading of the fun employment line. Sandy, who is normally written as a brilliant and likable scientist, spends one scene feeding unsuspecting characters what appears to be toxic waste as part of an experiment testing their intelligence. This moment struck many longtime viewers as wildly out of character for her, since nothing else in the show's history shows her running unethical experiments on unwilling subjects. This single scene has followed her reputation in fan discussions ever since, often getting brought up whenever people argue about which characters the show has written inconsistently over the years. Mr. Krabs comes out of this episode looking just as harsh as he does in some of the show's other most criticized moments. His entire reason for firing SpongeBob, someone the show has established over and over again as his single best and most loyal employee is that he wants to save 1 nickel. Fan discussions and critical write-ups have specifically named this decision as one of the pettiest and most needlessly cruel things Krabs has ever done across the whole series, especially since the show has shown many times before that the Krusty Krab falls apart almost immediately without SpongeBob running the grill. Some critics pointed out that this creates a strange gap in the story, since Krabs has clearly learned this lesson multiple times in earlier episodes, yet somehow forgets it here just to set up the plot one more time. After getting fired from the Krusty Krab, SpongeBob spends the middle portion of the episode trying out a string of new jobs, each one ending in failure through no real fault of his own, beyond simple bad luck and a habit of turning everything he cooks into some version of a patty. He briefly works at a place called the Weenie Hut, where he invents something called a weenie patty instead of making a normal hot dog, and gets fired for it. He tries out at a pizza restaurant and creates a pizza patty rather than an actual pizza, resulting in another firing. He attempts work at a taco restaurant, produces a burrito patty that ends up spraying filling onto customers, and gets let go again. He finishes his string of attempts at a noodle restaurant, where his noodle patty creation gets thrown directly back at him before he is sent packing one final time. By the end of this sequence, SpongeBob has technically been let go from 5 different jobs in a single day, though the episode's own dialogue only counts 4, a small inconsistency that attentive fans noticed and pointed out afterward. Worn down and out of options, SpongeBob eventually decides to make something for Gary out of ingredients he has on hand, since he has run out of the usual snail food Gary eats. He turns out to be talented at this too, whipping up a homemade version that Gary loves immediately. This small moment sets up what several critics have pointed to as a missed opportunity within the episode. SpongeBob, discovering he has a real talent for making snail food, could have easily turned into an entirely new job path for him, maybe even a small business of his own, giving him a way to prove his own worth completely separate from the Krusty Krab. Instead, the show drops this idea almost as quickly as it introduces it, moving on to a chaotic final act where the various fast food managers who fired him earlier in the day team up to kidnap him, having realized after the fact that his cooking ideas were actually good for business. The episode wraps up the way almost every SpongeBob story about him losing his job eventually wraps up. Squidward, unable to handle running the grill himself and dealing with the chaos of the restaurant falling apart without SpongeBob there, eventually asks Krabs to bring him back. Krabs realizes his mistake, admits he was wrong to fire SpongeBob over something as small as a single nickel, and SpongeBob returns to his job at the Krusty Krab, exactly as things stood before the episode started. Nothing about SpongeBob's circumstances has changed by the final scene. He is back at the grill, Krabs is back to underpaying him the same as always, and the show resets completely, the same way it resets after almost every episode involving major conflict between these two characters. This ending drew its own separate criticism from longtime viewers, who pointed out how familiar this pattern had become by season 9. Fans who had followed the show for years already knew, going into the episode, that SpongeBob would end up back at his old job no matter what happened along the way, since the show has never seriously considered permanently changing his employment situation across its entire run. Knowing the ending in advance made some viewers feel like the entire hour of television carried very little actual tension, since nothing that happens to SpongeBob throughout the episode ever felt like it could really stick. Taken as a whole, SpongeBob You're Fired stands out in the show's history for a reason that has nothing to do with dark humor, suicide jokes, or disturbing imagery, all things that show up in some of the show's other most talked about episodes. This episode became notable because a single throwaway line, likely written without any political intention behind it at all, managed to pull the entire show into a real national conversation about welfare, unemployment, and how children's media handles real-world economic topics. It is a rare example of a cartoon accidentally becoming part of the news cycle, rather than deliberately trying to make any kind of statement. And it shows how a show that has survived so many manufactured controversies over the years can still get caught off guard by something nobody saw coming until it was already airing on national television. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Mr. Krabs treats SpongeBob's job as something worth sacrificing over a single nickel, which echoes the same casual cruelty that shows up in some of the show's darkest episodes. That pattern gets harder to laugh off once you see what he does to someone else in the cast, someone the show pushes into a state that looks a lot closer to real depression than simple cartoon sadness. Section 4. Are You Happy Now? The episode that put depression on screen. Squidward Tentacles has been the grumpy neighbor of this show since the very first episode aired back in 1999. For most of the show's history, his bad mood has worked as a punchline. He hates his job, he hates SpongeBob's constant energy, and he spends most episodes reacting to chaos around him with a sigh and a complaint. Audiences have laughed at this version of Squidward for decades. Are You Happy Now? An episode from season 8 takes that same character and pushes him somewhere the show had never actually gone before. Instead of grumpy, Squidward becomes something that looks a lot closer to genuinely depressed, and the episode shows this in ways specific enough that critics, fans, and even casual viewers noticed something had shifted. The episode starts off in a way that feels completely normal for the show. SpongeBob is at the Krusty Krab, flipping through a book while giggling to himself. Squidward, curious and annoyed as usual, asks what he is looking at. SpongeBob explains that the book is full of what he calls his happiest memories, page after page of moments from his life that made him feel good. It is a small detail, but it fits SpongeBob's character perfectly. He has always been shown as someone who finds joy in almost everything, so having an entire book dedicated to cataloging his happiest moments tracks with everything the show has already established about him. Squidward picks up the book, glances through it, and drops it onto the grill, where it burns up. SpongeBob is not upset about this, since it turns out he has an entire cabinet full of backup copies, a small joke about just how much happiness he has stored up over the years. Then SpongeBob turns the question around and asks Squidward what his own happiest memory is. This is the moment where the entire tone of the episode begins to shift. Squidward pauses to think. A thought bubble appears above his head, and instead of showing any kind of memory, it shows static, the kind of fuzzy black and white noise that appears on an old television with no signal. The bubble then cuts briefly to a color bar test pattern, the kind of screen that shows up when a broadcast has nothing actually playing. Then the thought bubble disappears entirely. Squidward sighs and simply says he guesses he does not have a happiest memory, before walking off like the conversation is already over. This single moment, played completely straight without any punchline attached to it, is the detail that a lot of critics and longtime viewers point to as the true starting point of the episode's dark turn. A children's cartoon character searching his own memory for a single happy moment and coming up with nothing but static is not a joke in the traditional sense. It reads as something closer to an actual depiction of someone who has lost touch with any sense of joy in his own life, unable to locate a single moment worth holding on to. SpongeBob does not let this go. Once he realizes Squidward genuinely cannot think of a happy memory, he becomes determined to fix it, offering to help Squidward create one from scratch. Squidward, worn down enough to stop resisting, agrees to go along with it. What follows is a string of attempts, each one meant to give Squidward some kind of joyful experience, and each one ending in disaster through no real fault of Squidward's own. The first attempt takes them to a concert, something that should appeal to Squidward, given how much the show has always emphasized his love of music and the arts. Instead of enjoying himself, Squidward ends up getting accidentally struck in the eye by a violin bow during the performance. The next attempt brings them to the Bikini Bottom Museum, where SpongeBob has arranged for one of Squidward's own sculptures to be displayed. For a brief moment, this actually seems to work. Squidward is thrilled, watching a group of art lovers admire his work, watching a museum curator introduce him by name as the artist behind the piece. Then, a performance artist named Fiasco steps forward, pulls out a flamethrower, and burns Squidward's sculpture to the ground in front of the entire crowd, replacing the sign that credited Squidward with one crediting Fiasco instead for burning it. The moment of pride Squidward briefly felt gets destroyed just as quickly as it appeared. SpongeBob keeps trying anyway. He takes Squidward on a hot air balloon ride next, hoping the view might do the trick. It turns out Squidward is afraid of heights, something SpongeBob apparently did not know or forgot to consider. When SpongeBob attempts to bring the balloon back down by popping it with a needle, the two of them crash directly into the side of a mountain, ruining another character's attempt to be the first person to reach its peak, before the group ends up sliding down the mountain in an avalanche. By the time they make it back to their homes, Squidward has been shot in the eye, watched his art destroyed, discovered a fear he did not know how to plan around, survived a balloon crash, and lived through an avalanche ranch, all in pursuit of a single happy memory that never actually arrives. At this point, Squidward gives up entirely. He tells SpongeBob directly that he is done trying to find a happiest memory, adding that if he ever does find one, it definitely will not involve SpongeBob at all. He shuts himself inside his house and locks the door. What happens over the next stretch of the episode is the part that generated the most conversation and the most discomfort among viewers, both when it originally aired and in the years since. Squidward is shown walking up the stairs of his own home in a way the animation clearly frames as heavy and defeated, saying out loud that he might as well go to bed for 100 years, adding that someone should wake him when he is dead. He climbs into bed, rolls over, and ends up falling completely underneath it, letting out one final sigh before the scene cuts away. A title card appears on screen, stating that 2 weeks have passed. 2 full weeks, according to the story, during which Squidward has not left his house even once. SpongeBob eventually grows worried enough to check on him. He knocks on the door and gets no answer. He looks through the mail slot and sees that Squidward's house has become a mess, with mail and belongings scattered everywhere, a visual detail the show uses to suggest that Squidward has stopped taking care of himself or his home entirely during this stretch of isolation. SpongeBob eventually spots him through a window, but Squidward responds by pulling the blinds shut on both windows, cutting off contact rather than letting anyone in. The one comment SpongeBob makes in this moment, saying that at least now they know Squidward is still alive, lands as an unusually blunt acknowledgement for this show, treating Squidward's isolation as something serious enough that his continued existence needed confirming at all. Inside his house, the show depicts Squidward with visible signs of neglect. He has grown a rough beard, something the show has never shown on him before or since, generally used across television and film as a visual shorthand for someone who has stopped caring for themselves during a period of depression. He is shown repeating the phrase that he cannot seem to get happy, a line that shows up more than once throughout this stretch of the episode, delivered without any of the show's usual comedic timing attached to it. 2 specific moments during this section of the episode became the most talked about and most argued over pieces of the entire hour, and they remain the reason this episode still comes up in conversations about the show's darkest content more than a decade after it originally aired. In the first moment, Squidward is shown opening his oven, and the immediate visual suggests he might be about to harm himself using it. The scene resolves by revealing he was simply checking on a batch of brownies he had been baking, which turn out to be burned. In the second moment, Squidward is shown throwing a rope up over a beam in his ceiling and pulling it taut, again suggesting something far darker than what the scene actually delivers. The rope turns out to be attached to a small cage holding a pet clam, which sprays him with liquid the moment it comes down. Another gag rather than anything more serious. Both of these moments follow the exact same structure. The show sets up an image strongly associated with self-harm, holds on that image just long enough for the implication to register, and then reveals something harmless and silly instead. This kind of bait and switch has shown up in comedy for a long time, in shows aimed at adults and children alike, generally used to get a nervous laugh out of an audience that briefly feared something much worse was about to happen. What made these 2 specific instances land so differently is the surrounding context. These jokes are not standalone moments dropped into an otherwise lighthearted episode. They appear in the middle of a storyline that has already spent significant time establishing Squidward as someone experiencing something that looks like real depression, someone who has not left his home in 2 weeks, someone who has stopped taking care of himself, someone who has repeatedly stated he cannot find happiness anywhere in his life. Placing a self-harm shaped joke inside that specific context changes how the joke reads, since the audience has already been told through the show's own storytelling that this character is in genuine distress rather than simply being his usual grumpy self. Fan discussion boards from around the time the episode aired capture this reaction happening in real time. Viewers posting shortly after the episode first aired described feeling uncomfortable specifically because of how the show set up these 2 moments, saying the jokes made them deeply uneasy in a way that overshadowed the rest of the episode for them. Some fans pointed out that the show had used death-related or morbid jokes plenty of times before across its history without generating this kind of reaction, and argued the difference here came down to how seriously the show had treated Squidward's depression in the build-up, making the jokes that followed feel like they were mocking something the story itself had just spent several minutes treating as real. Eventually, SpongeBob decides on one final attempt to bring Squidward some same kind of happiness. Unable to invite any actual friends to a party because everyone he asks is either too busy or sick, he solves the problem by making thousands of papier-mâché figures shaped like himself and setting them up throughout the Krusty Krab, creating a party made almost entirely out of copies of his own face. When Squidward finally emerges and sees this scene, something in him snaps. He does not respond with warmth or gratitude. He responds by flying into a rage, tearing through the restaurant and smashing every single papier-mâché figure with wild, manic energy, screaming as he destroys them one after another. The episode ends on this image, with SpongeBob looking at the wreckage and the completely worn out but now strangely energized Squidward, declaring that Squidward is finally happy. The final line of the episode has Squidward looking off at something, presumably a character off screen, and simply saying that he is handsome, a moment many fans found random and disconnected from everything that had just happened, closing the episode on a note that felt more confusing than satisfying. The way this ending resolved Squidward's arc became its own point of criticism once people had time to sit with the full episode. Squidward does technically end up happy by the final scene, but the path to get there involves a complete emotional collapse, rather than anything resembling actual comfort, support, or resolution. He does not find peace through connection with another character, or through rediscovering something he loves. He finds it through destroying dozens of physical objects in a state that looks a lot closer to a breakdown than a breakthrough. Critics writing about the episode in the years since have pointed out that this ending suggests something fairly bleak underneath the surface. The idea that the only way this character can access happiness at all is through total loss of control, rather than through anything healthy or sustainable. Beyond the specific gags involving the oven and the rope, the broader shape of this episode drew attention on its own terms. This was not the first time the show had shown Squidward feeling down about something. His job frustrations, his failed art career, his strained relationship with his neighbors. All of these had been recurring parts of his character for years by the time this episode aired. What made this episode different was the specific and sustained nature of what he goes through here. This is not Squidward being annoyed for 20 minutes and then moving on, the way he does in most episodes. This is Squidward being shown isolated for 2 full weeks, physically changed by neglect, repeating language about being unable to feel happy, and ending the episode through what looks a lot more like a psychological break than a typical cartoon resolution. It is worth being fair to the other side of how people have read this episode as well. Not every viewer or critic came away from it with the same level of discomfort. Some fans watching it at the time, and plenty who have rewatched it since, described the episode as genuinely funny in parts, pointing specifically to the museum sequence with Fiasco and the general absurdity of SpongeBob's increasingly disastrous attempts to help, as being in line with the show's usual sense of humor. Some viewers pushed back directly against the idea that the episode was trying to say anything serious about depression at all, arguing that reading real mental health struggles into an exaggerated cartoon plotline says more about the audience doing the reading than about anything the writers actually intended. Even among people who found the episode uncomfortable, there is a recognizable pattern in what specifically bothered them, which points to something worth naming plainly. The discomfort rarely comes from Squidward being sad. Sadness on this show has never been treated as off-limits, and Squidward being disappointed or frustrated is part of his character from the very beginning. The discomfort comes from a much more specific and recognizable idea buried inside the episode, one that shows up constantly in real conversations about depression outside of cartoons entirely. SpongeBob spends the entire episode believing that enough forced fun, enough activities, enough effort thrown at the problem from the outside will eventually fix whatever is wrong with Squidward. Every single attempt SpongeBob makes fails, sometimes in painful and literal ways, and Squidward's condition does not improve through any of it. If anything, his condition gets worse the more SpongeBob pushes, right up until he shuts himself away completely for 2 weeks. That specific shape, someone trying to cheer up a person going through something real, using activities and forced positivity instead of actually addressing what is happening underneath, is something a lot of people recognize from their own lives, whether they have experienced it from the outside trying to help someone, or from the inside as the person being pushed toward happiness that will not arrive no matter how hard someone else tries to manufacture it. This episode did not appear out of nowhere. Squidward's frustration, his sense that his life has not turned into what he once hoped it would be, and his complicated relationship with SpongeBob's relentless optimism have all been part of his character since the earliest seasons of the show. What are you happy now now did was take pieces the show had already been building quietly for years and push them further than any single episode had gone before, turning a background character trait into the entire focus of a story, and doing it with enough specific, recognizable detail that a large number of viewers walked away from it seeing something they had not expected to see in a children's cartoon. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Understanding why this particular episode hit as hard as it did requires looking further back than Season 8. Squidward's disappointment did not begin here, and it does not end here either. Long before this episode ever aired, the show had already been quietly building him into something closer to its emotional center than its comic relief, giving him a specific backstory involving a failed career, a specific set of dreams that never worked out, and a specific kind of loneliness that none of the other characters in Bikini Bottom seemed to carry in quite the same way. Section 5. Squidward Tentacles, the failed artist the show takes seriously. Every single main character on this show wants something. SpongeBob wants to work at the Krusty Krab and make everyone around him happy. Patrick wants to do as little as possible and enjoy every second of it. Mr. Krabs wants money, more of it than he could ever spend, and does not seem to care how he gets it. Sandy wants to prove she is the smartest and toughest creature in Bikini Bottom, land animal or sea animal. All of these characters get what they want on a regular basis. SpongeBob flips patties every single day without fail. Patrick does absolutely nothing and faces almost no consequences for it. Krabs keeps piling up cash, no matter how many schemes fall apart around him. Sandy wins nearly every contest of strength or intelligence she enters. Squidward Tentacles is the one character in this entire cast who almost never gets what he wants, and the show treats that failure with a level of seriousness it does not give to anyone else living in Bikini Bottom. Squidward's full name, as given in the show, is Squidward Quincy Tentacles. He works as the cashier at the Krusty Krab, a job he has held for years despite hating almost every part of it. Outside of work, his real passion has always been the clarinet, an instrument he plays constantly and believes he has real talent for. The show has been consistent on this point since its earliest seasons. Squidward considers himself a serious musician and a serious artist, someone capable of far more than working a cash register at a fast food restaurant that sells food made from a formula belonging to someone else. The show rarely lets him prove this belief correct, but it also rarely mocks him for holding it. Instead, it treats his ambition as something real, something worth taking seriously, even when the results are embarrassing. The clearest evidence that his belief in his own talent does not match reality comes through in almost every scene where he actually plays the clarinet. His neighbors, mainly SpongeBob and Patrick, react to his playing with visible pain, plugging their ears or making faces of pure suffering whenever he practices. The show never once shows an outside character praising his music honestly. Every single reaction to his clarinet playing throughout the series ranges from polite tolerance to open horror. Despite this, Squidward keeps playing, keeps practicing, and keeps believing that one day the world will recognize what he is convinced he already has. This gap between how Squidward sees himself and how the world actually sees him becomes the entire foundation for one of the most important recurring characters in his story, a squid named Squilliam Fancyson. Squilliam and Squidward went to school together, both of them playing clarinet during their younger years, and the show makes clear through several episodes that Squilliam ended up with everything Squidward wanted for himself. Squilliam has money, Squilliam has fame, Squilliam has actual musical success, along with a general air of superiority that he uses specifically to remind Squidward how far apart their lives have grown. The episode that defines this rivalry more than any other is called Band Geeks, and it comes from Season 2 of the show. The setup begins with Squilliam calling Squidward on the phone, mentioning that his own band is doing extremely well, and asking, in a tone dripping with condescension, how Squidward's band is doing these days. Squidward, caught off guard and unwilling to admit he does not actually have a band at all, lies on the spot and claims his own group is doing great, even going so far as to challenge Squilliam to a competition between their two bands. The moment he hangs up the phone, the full weight of what he has just done hits him. He has no band. He has no musicians. He has committed himself publicly to a competition he has absolutely no way of winning, all because he could not stand the idea of Squilliam thinking he had fallen behind in life. What follows is Squidward scrambling to put together some version of a band using the only people available to him, the residents of Bikini Bottom, almost none of whom have any actual musical training. SpongeBob, Patrick, Mr. Krabs, Sandy, and a collection of other familiar background characters get recruited into this desperate lineup. The rehearsal scenes that follow are shown as genuinely disastrous, filled with wrong notes, chaos, and Squidward's own visible exhaustion and humiliation as he tries to whip this group into something resembling a real band in an impossibly short amount of time. What makes this episode different from most of Squidward's other stories is how the show chooses to shoot these rehearsal failures. Rather than playing his frustration purely for laughs the way it usually does, the animation lingers on his face during several of these moments in a way that reads as genuine exhaustion rather than simple comedic annoyance. This is a small detail, but it is the kind of detail that separates an episode meant purely as a joke machine from one that wants the audience to actually feel something alongside the character going through it. The night of the competition arrives, and against every expectation the episode has built up, the performance actually works. The ragtag group Squidward assembled comes together and delivers a full, polished performance of a song called Sweet Victory, complete with lighting, choreography, and a level of coordination that nothing earlier in the episode suggested was possible. The crowd goes silent during the performance, then erupts once it ends. Squilliam, watching from the audience with his own polished professional band standing right beside him, faints on the spot from the shock of watching Squidward actually succeed. This single episode has taken on a life of its own in the years since it originally aired. It regularly appears at or near the top of fan-voted lists ranking the best episodes across the show's entire history. Part of the reason it holds up so strongly comes down to what it does for Squidward specifically. This is one of the only moments across more than 2 decades of episodes where Squidward wants something, works for it, and actually gets it without the show immediately snatching it away or turning the moment into another joke at his expense. The performance is not undercut. Squilliam does not somehow win in the end. Squidward gets his victory, and the show lets him have it completely. That kind of unqualified success is rare enough for this character that it stands out clearly against everything else the show has done with him. Squilliam Fancy Son did not disappear after this episode either. He returns in later seasons, most notably in an episode called Squilliam Returns, where he shows up at the Krusty Krab specifically to rub his success in Squidward's face one more time, forcing Squidward into another humiliating scramble to prove he has moved up in the world since they last saw each other. The rivalry between these two characters keeps getting revisited throughout the show's run, precisely because it captures something the writers clearly found worth returning to again and again: the specific and recognizable pain of watching someone you grew up alongside pass you by completely. Squidward's artistic ambitions were not limited to music either. The show gave him a parallel story about visual art through an episode called Artist Unknown, which digs even deeper into how far he is willing to go for recognition. In this episode, SpongeBob asks Squidward to give him painting lessons, hoping to learn from someone he believes is a serious artist. Squidward agrees, mostly expecting SpongeBob to be terrible at it, which would let him feel superior for a while. Instead, through a series of accidents, rather than any real skill, SpongeBob ends up producing a painting that is genuinely good, a self-portrait that catches real attention. Rather than celebrating this, or admitting what actually happened, Squidward makes a decision that reveals exactly how desperate he is for the kind of recognition he has never managed to earn honestly. He takes credit for SpongeBob's painting, entering it into an art contest under his own name. The painting wins. Squidward gets the praise, the attention, and the validation he has wanted his entire life, all built on a lie. The episode does not let him keep this victory clean the way Band Geeks did. Guilt eventually catches up with him, and by the end of the story, he admits the truth, giving SpongeBob the credit he actually deserves. What this episode reveals about Squidward's character goes beyond just another failed scheme. It shows a character willing to compromise his own honesty for a taste of the exact kind of recognition Band Geeks gave him honestly. The two episodes sit next to each other, almost like opposite outcomes of the same underlying need. In one, he earns his moment fairly and gets to keep it. In the other, he steals his moment and eventually has to give it back. Both stories only work because the show has built Squidward into a character who wants something real, badly enough to risk humiliation, dishonesty, and constant failure chasing after it. This pattern extends beyond music and painting into other areas of his life as well. An episode called House Fancy shows Squidward fantasizing about a career as a celebrated interior designer, imagining himself hosting his own television show dedicated to home decorating. Another storyline shows him opening his own school, specifically so he can finally be seen as an authority figure with knowledge worth teaching to others. Across all of these different attempts, whether it involves music, painting, design, or teaching, the underlying want stays exactly the same. Squidward is chasing a version of his own life where he is respected, admired, and recognized as talented, rather than mocked or ignored. And the show keeps finding new ways to put him through this exact same cycle of hope followed by disappointment. None of the other characters in Bikini Bottom get put through this specific cycle in the same repeated way. SpongeBob occasionally fails at things, but his failures rarely connect to some deeper, unmet ambition the way Squidward's do. When SpongeBob fails his boating test over and over again across multiple episodes, the show treats it as a running joke, rather than a window into some deeper personal tragedy. When Squidward fails to get recognition for his art or his music, the show consistently frames it as something that actually hurts him, something that connects to a much bigger and more painful gap between who he believes he is and who the world actually sees. This is also connected directly to what happens in the episode covered earlier in this video, where Squidward spends 2 weeks locked inside his own house, unable to locate a single happy memory anywhere in his life. That entire storyline only carries the weight it does because of everything already established about him across years of earlier episodes. Audiences already know, going into that episode, that Squidward has spent his whole life chasing recognition as a musician and an artist, that he has a specific rival who represents everything he wishes he had become, and that he has experienced both real, earned success and humiliating public failure while chasing that exact same dream. A character with no established wants or history could not carry a storyline about total emotional collapse in the same way. Squidward's collapse works specifically because the show spent years beforehand making sure the audience understood exactly what he wanted and exactly how often life refused to give it to him. There is a version of Squidward that could have existed on this show that never gets built this way. He could have simply been the grumpy neighbor forever, a walking punchline whose only function is to react badly to whatever chaos SpongeBob and Patrick create around him. Plenty of side characters across the show's massive cast exist exactly this way, filling out the world of Bikini Bottom without ever needing a deeper internal life. Squidward is not written like this. He gets a specific rival with a specific shared history. He gets a specific artistic passion the show revisits again and again across different mediums, from clarinet to painting to interior design. He gets moments of real earned triumph, and he gets moments of complete devastation. And both kinds of moments connect directly back to the exact same underlying want that has defined him since some of the show's earliest seasons. This groundwork matters when trying to understand why certain episodes involving Squidward land so much harder than similar episodes involving other characters. When Squidward suffers, the show has already done the work of making that suffering feel connected to something real and specific about who he is, rather than existing as a one-time gag with no history behind it. That groundwork is a big part of why an episode built around his depression could work as effectively as it did, and it is also part of why the characters sitting across from him throughout so many of these stories, a boss who consistently treats Squidward and everyone else at the Krusty Krab as expendable the moment money enters the picture, comes across as increasingly hard to laugh off the more these two characters' stories get placed side by side. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That boss has his own pattern worth examining closely, one that stretches far beyond a single nickel or a single frightened rival, showing up again and again across the show's history in ways that turn a lovable cartoon miser into something a lot of longtime viewers now describe using much harsher words than they ever expected to use about a children's show character. Section 6. Mr. Krabs, the slow turn from funny miser to something darker. Every long-running cartoon needs a character defined by one simple trait that keeps generating conflict, episode after episode, without ever needing much explanation. For Mr. Krabs, that trait has always been money. He loves it more than almost anything else in his life, a fact the show has repeated constantly since its very first season, most famously through his own catchphrase, delivered with total sincerity every time it comes up, where he simply says he likes money. For a long stretch of the show's early years, this greed stayed mostly harmless. It got him into trouble, caused problems for the the people around him, and usually resolved itself by the end of an episode. Somewhere across the show's later seasons, that same greed stopped feeling like a funny personality quirk and started looking, to a lot of longtime viewers and critics, like something closer to actual cruelty. The clearest and most direct evidence of how little Krabs pays his own employees comes straight from information the show itself has confirmed. SpongeBob, established repeatedly across the entire series as the single best fry cook the Krusty Krab has ever had, someone the restaurant falls apart without whenever he is absent, earns an amount of money so small that multiple sources tracking the show's own internal details have confirmed his pay works out to just a few dollars a month. This is not an exaggeration pulled from fan speculation. It comes directly from details established within the show's own episodes and reference material. A worker responsible for the restaurant's entire success, someone customers specifically show up hoping to be served by, brings home close to nothing for it, while the man who owns the restaurant continues piling up money by nearly any means available to him. This detail alone might have stayed a small, mostly ignored fact buried in the show's background. What turned it into something people actually started writing and thinking seriously about was an episode called Squid on Strike, which puts Krabs' treatment of his employees directly at the center of the plot, rather than leaving it in the background. The episode begins with Squidward getting hurt on the job, an injury that happens because of unsafe conditions at the restaurant. Rather than showing any concern, Krabs refuses to give him a break to recover, refuses to pay for any kind of overtime, and generally treats the injury as an inconvenience, rather than something he holds any responsibility for. Squidward, pushed past his usual level of complaint, decides to fight back by organizing a labor strike, trying to get SpongeBob to join him in refusing to keep working until Krabs agrees to treat his employees fairly. SpongeBob, ever loyal to his job and to Krabs personally, refuses to strike and keeps working through the entire dispute, which drains almost all the power out of Squidward's protest. Krabs, watching this play out, does not respond with any kind of guilt or self-reflection about how he treats the people working for him. He simply exploits the fact that SpongeBob will keep working no matter what, using that loyalty against Squidward's attempt to demand better treatment. This particular episode became one of the most frequently cited pieces of evidence in a wave of academic writing that emerged around the show over the years, treating Bikini Bottom as a case study for how real-world labor and business relationships work. Multiple published papers, written by students and researchers studying media and literature, have used this episode and others like it to walk through a formal breakdown of Krabs as an employer who holds all the power in his relationship with his workers, using that power specifically to avoid paying fair wages, avoid providing safe working conditions, and avoid any accountability when his employees get hurt doing the job he assigns them. One frequently referenced piece of writing on this subject, built around a different episode called Drive-Thru, walks through a similar argument using the framework of two economic classes in direct conflict, one holding money and power, the other holding nothing but their own labor to offer in exchange for survival. The paper argues that Krabs fits cleanly into the role of the owner who benefits from his workers without ever meaningfully sharing that benefit with them, while Squidward and SpongeBob fit into the role of workers who have no real path to fight back against unfair treatment, since their only real option, if they refuse to accept it, is losing their jobs entirely. This same argument gets made across several other pieces of writing focused on different episodes throughout the show's run, including one specifically built around an episode called Squilliam Returns, and another built around an episode focused on the Krusty Krab's daily operations. Each of these separate pieces of writing, done independently by different people, keeps landing on the exact same basic conclusion. Krabs treats the people working for him as tools for making money, rather than as people whose well-being matters to him in any real way. And the show, whether intentionally or not, keeps giving viewers new evidence for this same basic reading almost every time Krabs and his employees interact. An even more literal example of Krabs prioritizing money over almost anything else comes from an episode called Born Again Krabs. In this story, Krabs makes a deal with a character called the Flying Dutchman, a ghost who haunts the seas around Bikini Bottom, agreeing to sell his own soul in exchange for a small amount of money. The specific amount he accepts for this trade is 62 cents. This detail has stuck with fans for years, specifically because of how small the number is. Krabs does not need convincing through some elaborate scheme or moment of desperation. He simply hands over his soul for less less money than most people would spend on a piece of candy. A moment the show plays largely for comedy, but one that also functions as one of the most direct and literal statements the show has ever made about exactly how far this character is willing to go for money given the chance. Another episode, called Selling Out, pushes this same theme into a different kind of story. Rather than an employee dispute or a supernatural bargain, this episode shows Krabs actually selling the Krusty Krab itself to a large corporation, walking away from the restaurant entirely in exchange for a payout. Once the sale goes through, the new corporate owners bring in different management, different rules, and different standards that end up making life miserable for both SpongeBob and Squidward, who suddenly find themselves working under a system with none of the familiarity or personal relationships that existed before, even if those relationships were already far from perfect under Krabs. The episode eventually has Krabs realize he misses the restaurant enough to want it back, and he manages to get it returned to him by the end of the story. What lingers from the episode is not the resolution, but the fact that Krabs was willing to abandon a business built entirely around loyal, hardworking employees the moment a large enough payday appeared in front of him. None of these individual episodes exist in isolation from each other. Once you put them side by side, alongside the two episodes covered earlier in this video, a much clearer pattern starts to take shape. In one episode, Krabs fires his single best employee to save a single nickel, an amount of money so small that even the show itself frames the decision as absurd, only to immediately regret it once the restaurant collapses without SpongeBob there to run the grill. In another episode, Krabs spends more than 2 weeks deliberately terrorizing his own business rival, using a private fear he discovered by accident, pushing that rival to the point of attempting to take his own life, and responding to news of that attempt with laughter rather than any concern. In Squid on Strike, he refuses basic fair treatment to an employee who was hurt doing his job. In Born Again Krabs, he sells his own soul for less money than a candy bar. In Selling Out, he walks away from the business and the people who built it the moment a corporate buyer waves enough cash in front of him. Individually, several of these moments can be explained away as one-time jokes, exaggerated for comedic effect, the way cartoons often exaggerate character traits to make a point quickly and clearly. Taken together, across more than 2 decades of episodes, they stop looking like isolated jokes and start looking like a consistent pattern the show keeps returning to again and again, whether the writers behind each individual episode were thinking about the larger pattern or not. Krabs is written over and over as a character who will choose money over people almost every single time he is given the choice, and the show rarely makes him face any lasting consequence for it. The restaurant always survives. SpongeBob always comes back. Krabs always ends up right back where he started, ready to make the exact same choice again the next time an opportunity for profit shows up. This is part of what makes the earlier episodes covered in this video land as hard as they do. When Krabs fires SpongeBob over a nickel, it does not exist as a strange, isolated writing choice made for one single episode. It fits directly into a character the show had already been building for years, an employer who treats the people working under him as expendable the second money enters the equation. When Krabs laughs at Plankton's suicide attempt, rather than showing any concern, that reaction does not come out of nowhere either. It fits a version of this character the show had already spent years establishing, someone capable of extreme cruelty toward anyone standing between him and money, whether that person is his own loyal employee or his longtime business rival. What makes this pattern especially strange to sit with is how the show frames Krabs across almost all of these episodes. He is never written or presented as a villain. SpongeBob still loves working for him. The show consistently treats him as a lovable, if flawed, boss, rather than someone genuinely dangerous to be around. Episodes rarely, if ever, end with SpongeBob or Squidward walking away from him entirely, despite everything he puts them through across the show's run. He gets forgiven over and over, treated by the narrative itself as someone whose greed is just an amusing character flaw, rather than something that has caused real, documented harm to the people around him repeatedly across the show's history. This gap between how seriously the show treats Krabs' behavior and how seriously outside viewers, critics, and academic writers have started treating that same behavior is part of what makes this whole subject worth examining closely. A children's cartoon built its most consistent and long-running joke around a boss who exploits, underpays, endangers, and occasionally outright torments the people around him, and did this consistently enough across more than 20 years of episodes that entire academic papers now exist specifically breaking down his behavior using real economic theory built to describe real-world labor exploitation. Nobody sat down at the start of the show's run and decided to build a formal critique of workplace power imbalances into a cartoon about a sponge who works at a fast food restaurant. The pattern emerged anyway, episode after episode, built out of small character choices that added up into something much bigger than any single writer likely intended when they sat down to write one more Krabs episode about him chasing after money one more time. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That accidental pattern is exactly what turned this show into something academics started studying seriously, treating a cartoon about a talking sponge as a genuine text worth breaking down using real economic and political theory. The same tools normally reserved for serious literature and film, applied instead to a fast food restaurant run by a crab who once sold his soul for less money than a candy bar. Section 7. Why college professors started writing papers about a cartoon sponge. Somewhere along the way, this show about a sponge who lives in a pineapple stopped being something people only talked about as a kid's cartoon. It became something people started studying, the same way they study novels, movies, and plays in a college classroom. Actual research papers exist, written by actual students and professors, breaking down specific episodes using real economic theory that was originally written to explain how businesses and workers interact in the real world. Nobody set out at the start of this show's run to create material serious enough for academic study. It happened anyway, built entirely out of small choices about how Mr. Krabs treats his employees. Choices repeated so many times across so many episodes that they eventually formed a pattern too consistent to ignore. To understand why this happened, it helps to understand the basic idea these papers keep using, explained in plain terms rather than academic language. There is an old way of looking at how businesses work, first written about by a thinker named Karl Marx a very long time ago, that splits the people involved in any business into two groups. One group owns the business itself, along with the building, the equipment, and the money needed to keep everything running. The other group does not own any of that. They only have their own time and effort to offer, which they trade to the business owner in exchange for a paycheck. The group that owns everything gets called the owning class in plain terms. The group that only has their labor to sell gets called the working class. Marx argued that owners tend to profit specifically by paying workers less than the actual value of the work those workers produce, keeping the difference for themselves. Once you know this basic idea, the entire structure of the Krusty Krab starts to look strangely familiar. Mr. Krabs owns the restaurant, the building, and the secret formula that makes the food special. SpongeBob and Squidward own none of this. They show up, do the actual work that keeps the business running, and get paid whatever Krabs decides to give them, which the show has established repeatedly is close to nothing at all. This setup did not require any secret message hidden by the writers. It is simply how the restaurant has always worked, visible in almost every single episode that takes place at the Krusty Krab. The paper most directly built around this exact comparison focuses on a specific episode called Drive-Thru. The person who wrote this piece of research went through the episode looking specifically for moments where Krabs treats his workers unfairly, moments where he pushes them to work harder without offering anything extra in return, and moments where the imbalance of power between an owner and his workers becomes visible on screen. The paper walks through specific lines of dialogue from the episode, including a moment where Krabs excitedly tells SpongeBob about a huge order coming in, gets him fired up and ready to work, and then reveals the actual demand, asking him to make 10,000 patties without any kind of break in between. SpongeBob, always eager to please, agrees without hesitation. The paper points to this exact exchange as a clear example of an owner using enthusiasm and loyalty to get more labor out of a worker than that worker would reasonably agree to if asked plainly and directly. This same paper also looks closely at Squidward's role in this specific episode, describing him as someone who understands, at least partly, that the arrangement he is stuck in is unfair. Squidward complains, pushes back verbally, and expresses frustration at how Krabs treats his employees throughout the episode. The paper points out that despite this awareness, Squidward has no real power to change anything about his situation. He cannot simply demand better treatment and expect Krabs to agree, because the only real leverage he has is threatening to quit, and quitting means losing his only source source of income. This dynamic, someone recognizing unfair treatment but staying stuck inside it because they have no better option, is exactly the kind of relationship the original economic theory was built to describe. And the paper argues that the show recreates this dynamic almost perfectly, without needing to change anything about it to make the comparison work. A separate piece of academic writing takes a wider approach, looking not just at one episode, but at 5 different episodes across the show's run, including one called Employee of the Month, one called Squilliam Returns, and the original strike episode discussed earlier in this video. This broader paper organizes its findings around several specific ideas borrowed from the same economic theory. One of these ideas involves workers competing against each other for an owner's approval, rather than working together to improve their shared situation, something the paper points to directly in Employee of the Month, where SpongeBob and Squidward end up competing fiercely against one another for a reward from Krabs, rather than recognizing that both of them are being treated unfairly by the same employer. Another idea covered in this same paper involves something called false belief, a term used to describe a situation where workers come to believe that the system treating them unfairly is actually fair, or even good for them, because they have been convinced to see things from the owner's point of view rather than their own. The paper argues that SpongeBob represents this idea almost perfectly. He genuinely loves his job, genuinely believes working at the Krusty Krab is the greatest thing that could ever happen to him, and shows no real awareness that he is being paid an extremely small amount of money to do work that generates massive profit for someone else. Where Squidward at least recognizes unfairness, even if he cannot escape it, SpongeBob does not seem to recognize it at all, and the paper treats this specific difference between the two characters as one of the most interesting parts of the whole comparison. This idea, the gap between how SpongeBob sees his job and how Squidward sees the exact same job, shows up again and again across different pieces of writing on this subject, written independently by different people who clearly landed on the same observation, without necessarily reading each other's work first. One widely shared piece of writing on this topic, written years ago and shared across the internet far beyond any academic setting, makes this exact comparison the center of its entire argument. The piece describes SpongeBob as the perfect example of a worker who has been fully convinced that his exploitation is actually a joy, someone who would probably keep showing up to flip patties even if Krabs stopped paying him entirely, simply because he loves the act of doing the work itself. Squidward, according to this same piece, represents the opposite reaction, someone who sees the unfairness clearly, resents it constantly, and represents anyone who has ever worked a job they know is treating them poorly, but stayed anyway because they had no better option available to them. This particular piece of writing takes its argument one step further than most of the formal academic papers, suggesting that the growing popularity of Squidward among adult fans of the show, especially fans who grew up loving SpongeBob as kids and came back to the show years later as working adults themselves, connects directly to this exact dynamic. As kids, most viewers identify naturally with SpongeBob, someone joyful, energetic, and endlessly positive about everything in his life. As adults, holding down real jobs of their own, many of these same viewers find themselves relating far more to Squidward, someone worn down by repetitive work, someone who understands exactly how exhausting it feels to show up every day for a job that does not respect the effort being put into it. The piece argues that this shift in identification, from SpongeBob as a kid to Squidward as an adult, mirrors a real emotional journey a lot of people experience once they enter the working world themselves. Beyond SpongeBob and Squidward specifically, other pieces of writing on this subject have expanded the comparison to look at the broader structure of Bikini Bottom as a whole. One frequently cited example involves how the show depicts competition between businesses. In the real world, businesses are often described as competing against each other by making better products or offering better prices, with customers benefiting from that competition. Several pieces of writing point out that this is not really how competition works in Bikini Bottom at all. The Krusty Krab and its main business rival, the Chum Bucket, owned by Plankton, do not really compete by trying to make better food. Chum Bucket food is consistently shown throughout the series as disgusting, something almost nobody actually wants to eat. Instead of competing honestly, Plankton spends nearly every episode trying to steal the secret formula for Krabby Patties, rather than trying to improve his own restaurant at all. Writers covering this topic have pointed out that this setup mirrors a specific argument Marx made about businesses under capitalism naturally drifting away from healthy competition and toward monopoly, where one business dominates completely quickly, and any rival simply tries to steal or copy what already works rather than innovating on their own. Even the treatment of money itself within the show has drawn this kind of academic attention. One term that shows up across several pieces of writing on this subject describes a situation where people start treating money and objects as if they have value and importance completely separate from the actual human relationships and human effort that created them in the first place. Writers covering this idea point directly to Mr. Krabs as an extreme, almost cartoonish example of this pattern. Krabs does not seem to value people, relationships, friendship, or loyalty in any meaningful way throughout most of the show's run. He values money above almost everything else, treating cash itself as something worth protecting, worshipping, and pursuing far beyond any reasonable need, a pattern that shows up in dozens of episodes where his obsession with money leads him to abandon good judgment, personal relationships, or basic decency toward the people who work for him. One piece of writing specifically points out something almost too perfect to be coincidental, describing how Krabs manages to represent both sides of this idea at once. He treats human beings, specifically his own employees, as though they exist purely to generate profit for him, rather than as people with their own needs and feelings. At the same time, he treats money itself with something close to genuine affection, speaking about it fondly, protecting it obsessively, and clearly finding more comfort and joy in a pile of cash than in almost any relationship shown across the entire series. The writer argues that flipping the normal relationship this completely, valuing money like a person while valuing actual people like tools, captures exactly what this specific economic theory was originally trying to describe, about how certain systems can distort human priorities over time. It would be easy to assume that a show built around this many uncomfortable ideas about work and money must have been created by someone with a specific political message they wanted to sneak into children's television. Nothing in the show's actual history supports that idea. Stephen Hillenburg, the marine science teacher who created the series, has never described the show in political terms in any of his public interviews or statements. The consistent explanation behind the show's creation involves his background studying ocean life and his interest in creating a colorful, imaginative underwater world filled with characters based loosely on real sea creatures. Not any interest in exploring economic theory or making a statement about capitalism. This actually makes the academic interest in the show more interesting rather than less. The writers were not building a secret critique of capitalism into every episode on purpose. They were simply writing what worked comedically for their specific characters, episode after episode, over more than 2 decades. Krabs needed to be greedy because greedy is funny and creates easy conflict for stories. SpongeBob needed to love his job because his relentless positivity is the entire foundation of his character. Squidward needed to hate his job because his misery next to SpongeBob's joy creates a natural comedic contrast that the show has leaned on since its earliest episodes. None of these choices were made with economic theory in mind. They were made because they made for good television. The fact that stacking these choices together across hundreds of episodes accidentally created something detailed enough for serious academic study says something interesting about how consistent character writing can build meaning nobody specifically planned for. It is worth noting that not everyone who has written about this subject agrees on how seriously to take it. Some pieces covering the same material take a much lighter tone, treating the whole comparison as a fun thought exercise rather than a genuine serious argument, something meant to make people laugh and think a little differently about a familiar show rather than a real claim that the writers were building deep political meaning into their scripts. Other pieces argue the opposite direction entirely, insisting the comparison holds up so consistently across so many different episodes that, intentional or not, the show genuinely functions as a serious piece of writing about work and class, regardless of what the original writers were thinking about when they created it. Both of these positions can be true at the same time without contradicting each other. The writers almost certainly were not building a secret economics lesson into a cartoon about a sponge who flips patties for a living. At the same time, the patterns these academic papers and articles point to are genuinely there in the actual episodes, visible to anyone who watches closely enough to notice them. SpongeBob really does get paid almost nothing for work that keeps an entire restaurant running. Krabs really does prioritize small amounts of money over the well-being of the people working for him, across episode after episode, stretching from the show's earliest seasons all the way through its later ones. Squidward really does spend years expressing frustration about unfair treatment, with no real path to improve his situation. situation. None of these facts require any stretch of imagination or creative interpretation to notice. They are simply sitting there in the show, built up slowly and consistently enough over more than 2 decades that eventually people trained to study exactly this kind of pattern in serious literature and film turned their attention toward a cartoon about a sponge and found more than enough material to work with. This pattern of small choices adding up into something much bigger than any single episode intended connects directly to almost everything covered earlier in this video. The same show that accidentally built a working case study in labor exploitation is the same show that accidentally built one of its permanent bans around a single uncomfortable plotline. The same show that accidentally walked into a real political news story over one throwaway line about unemployment, and the same show that ended up putting something close to a real depiction of depression on screen without ever explicitly announcing that was its intention. None of these things happened because a single writer sat down with a plan to make dark, serious television hiding inside a children's cartoon. They happened because a show running for more than 2 decades with a rotating team of different writers across different seasons kept making small individual choices that occasionally lined up into something much heavier than a normal episode about a sponge and his friends. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same pattern of accidental weight shows up again once you step outside the episodes themselves and start looking at how different countries around the world have handled this show once it leaves American television and gets broadcast somewhere else entirely, where entirely different standards for what counts as appropriate for children end up cutting, trimming, and rewriting specific scenes the original American broadcast never touched at all. Section 8. What other countries cut out that America never did? An episode airing on American television is not always the same episode airing somewhere else in the world. This is true for plenty of shows, but SpongeBob SquarePants has one of the longest documented histories of this kind of editing, with specific scenes tracked, dated, and confirmed as cut, trimmed, or replaced across different countries and different points in time. None of this is fan rumor. Wikis and fan researchers have gone through broadcast records, comparing versions frame by frame, and built out a detailed record of exactly what got removed, when it got removed, and why. Looking at this list is its own way of understanding what the show's actual darkest material looks like, since the specific scenes that different broadcasters chose to cut tend to be the scenes that made someone, somewhere, uncomfortable enough to act on it. Some of the earliest and most interesting cuts involve an episode built around SpongeBob ripping his pants, a plotline that became one of the character's most memorable early bits. In the original American version, after everyone around him grows tired of the same joke repeating over and over, SpongeBob ends up alone and sings a full, sincere song about his torn pants, treated by the show as a small, heartfelt moment buried inside a silly premise. In several countries outside the United States, this song never actually plays. Viewers in Italy and a handful of other regions get a version of the episode where SpongeBob simply starts singing, and the broadcast cuts straight to the very end of the song, skipping the entire performance in between. In some broadcasts, the image of his ripped pants themselves gets covered with a black censorship bar, a choice that ended up backfiring in an odd way, since covering something up tends to make viewers assume whatever is hidden must be far worse than what was actually there. A separate and much more serious edit involves a scene tied to a real-world event, rather than any concern about a joke being too silly or too revealing. One episode originally included a sequence where Squidward attempts to break into the Krusty Krab, accidentally sets himself on fire after tripping over a bucket of gasoline, then makes his way toward the restaurant's vault, only to get hit by a second bucket of gasoline, reigniting the flames a second time. This episode was scheduled to air just weeks after the September 11th terrorist attacks in the United States. Broadcasters made the decision to cut this specific fire sequence from the episode, a choice that fan researchers have connected directly to the timing, either out of respect for the victims of that tragedy or out of concern that footage of a building catching fire might land very differently for audiences only weeks removed from watching real footage of buildings burning on the news. This particular cut did not apply everywhere. Canadian and South Korean broadcasts kept the scene intact, and more recent American airings have also restored it, meaning this specific edit reflects a single, specific moment in time rather than a permanent, universal decision. Several other cuts point toward growing sensitivity around scenes involving weapons or the threat of physical harm, tracked and dated with enough precision to show a clear pattern over time. One recurring edit, applied starting in 2022, removes a scene where SpongeBob threatens his pet snail Gary, warning him that a device strapped to his body will explode unless Gary agrees to take a bath. The scene had aired without incident for years before this specific cut started appearing in newer broadcasts, suggesting a shift in how acceptable this kind of joke was considered, as standards changed over time, rather than any single controversy tied directly to this one moment. A similar pattern shows up around a scene involving SpongeBob and Patrick disguised as rocks, which gets smashed apart in a way the original animation played for slapstick laughs. This scene aired without cuts for years before eventually getting removed from broadcasts starting in 2022 as well. Around this same general period, a line of dialogue spoken by Plankton, where he describes his extended family as being able to become a real problem if they ever worked together, got edited out of newer broadcasts too. None of these specific edits were widely reported as reactions to any single public complaint or news story. They appear to reflect a broader, ongoing process where the people responsible for standards and practices at the network keep revisiting older episodes and quietly trimming material that would likely not get approved if the episode were being written fresh today. Household cooking scenes have drawn edits as well, which might sound like an unusual category until you consider what specific scene keeps getting flagged. Starting in 2021, a scene showing SpongeBob chopping onions in his kitchen began getting removed from certain broadcasts. Taken completely on its own, a cartoon character chopping vegetables sounds like the least controversial image imaginable. Fan researchers tracking this specific cut have connected it to broader concerns about young viewers imitating kitchen tool use after watching a character handle a knife on screen, part of a wider pattern across children's television where broadcasters have become more cautious about showing any character, human or otherwise, handling sharp objects in a kitchen setting. A scene involving a perfume department also picked up a partial cut starting in 2022, with roughly half of the original sequence removed from newer broadcasts. Documentation of exactly why this specific edit happened is less detailed than some of the other examples, though it fits the same general pattern of ongoing quiet trims applied to older material, as standards continue shifting years after an episode's original release. One of the most specific and clearly explained international edits involves a scene where a mysterious character, referred to as No Name, is shown cutting off the power to SpongeBob's house. For viewers watching the Nickelodeon UK broadcast, starting around 2008 or 2009, this scene was replaced entirely, swapped out for a simple shot of the closed front door of SpongeBob's house instead. This edit remained in place on UK broadcasts for well over a decade before the original, unedited version of the scene reappeared starting in 2022, matching a broader pattern where several older edits from the UK broadcast specifically got reversed and restored around this same general time period. Beyond individual scene cuts, entire episodes have faced broadcast bans in specific countries without ever being touched in the United States. Midlife Crustacean, the same episode permanently removed from American broadcast and streaming over its panty raid storyline, had actually already been banned in the United Kingdom years earlier, starting sometime around 2008 or 2009, well before the American ban took effect in 2018. This detail matters because it shows the American decision to finally pull the episode did not happen in isolation. British broadcasters had already identified the same content as inappropriate for their audience roughly a decade earlier, reaching the same basic conclusion through their own separate standards process, long before American regulators caught up to the same judgment. Music within specific episodes has also triggered edits, though for reasons connected to legal ownership rather than content concerns. One episode originally featured a song called Mavericks playing during a surfing sequence. Later broadcasts replaced this song entirely with a different track called Monster Wave, a change made because of copyright issues tied to the rights of the original song, rather than anything about its content being considered inappropriate. A similar copyright-driven change affected the title card music for one particular episode, originally set to a track called K55, later swapped out for a different piece of music called Secret Agent 00 SquarePants. These specific edits sit apart from the rest of the list, since they reflect ordinary licensing business decisions rather than any concern about the show's content itself, but they still show up in the same detailed record fans have built, tracking every difference between original and later versions of specific episodes. One particularly detailed piece of documented history involves an episode's original storyboard, the rough sketch version writers use to plan out a story before it gets fully animated. According to this storyboard record, an episode involving SpongeBob's grandmother originally included a much darker version of its plot than what eventually made it to air. The initial idea had the grandmother character planning to fatten up Gary the snail specifically so she could eat him, a plot point the show's own creative team decided was too dark before the episode was ever finished, changing the story so that she instead simply mistakes Gary for her own missing pet, rather than intending any harm toward him. This particular example stands apart from the rest of the list because it never actually aired in its darker form. Nobody had to cut or ban anything, since the writers caught the problem themselves during the planning stage and changed course before the episode was finished, which says something interesting on its own about where the show's own internal writers occasionally decided a joke had crossed a line worth stepping back from before an audience ever saw it. A similar early storyboard change involved a completely different holiday-themed episode. The original planned version of one storyboard included a scene where the show's version of a pirate host, a recurring live-action character named Patchy, gets a bandage ripped roughly off his skin in a way meant purely for a quick, painful laugh. This scene never made it into the finished episode either, cut during the planning process, for reasons that were never as clearly documented as some of the other examples on this list, though it fits the same basic pattern of material getting caught and removed before ever reaching broadcast at all. Taken individually, almost none of these specific cuts sound especially dramatic on their own. A vegetable chopping scene removed here, a fire sequence trimmed there, a joke about a scallop cage instead of a shot at genuine violence swapped out in a storyboard stage long before cameras ever needed to worry about it. What becomes interesting is looking at the full scope of this list all at once, built up gradually across more than 2 decades, covering everything from real-world tragedy sensitivity following September 11th to growing global caution around kitchen safety, to reversed decisions from a decade earlier getting quietly restored years later once cultural standards shifted again in the other direction. This constant back and forth, cutting things at one point in time only to restore them years later once attitudes shifted again, shows something worth sitting with about how a show running for more than 2 decades interacts with changing standards across its entire lifespan. The version of an episode a person saw as a kid in 2003 is not always the exact same version airing today, and the version airing in one country is not always the exact same version airing in another, all built on the same original scripts and animation, but shaped afterward by dozens of separate decisions made by different broadcasters trying to figure out, one specific scene at a time, exactly where their own local audience's comfort level actually sits. None of this documented editing history involves anything close to the scale of the 2 full episode bans covered earlier in this video, and none of it comes anywhere close to matching the specific intensity of a storyline built around an actual suicide attempt or a 2-week depressive collapse played out fully on screen. What this list does show is a show constantly being adjusted at the edges, small cut after small cut, revealing a pattern where the network keeps quietly deciding, scene by scene and country by country, that certain images and certain jokes carry more weight than the writers who originally created them ever seem to have intended. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That same idea, a show carrying more weight than its own writers ever consciously planned for, connects directly to something entirely separate from official bans, official cuts, or any decision ever made by a network standards department at all. It connects to what regular viewers themselves have done with this show over the years, taking its stranger and more unsettling details and building an entire separate universe of theories around them, treating a cartoon about a sponge and his friends as a puzzle hiding something much bigger underneath its cheerful cheerful surface. Section 9. The Internet's Dark Theory Machine. What fans built around this show. Every network decision covered so far in this video came from people with actual authority over the show. People at Nickelodeon making real choices about what could and could not air. This next part of the story does not involve the network at all. It involves regular viewers sitting at home, rewatching episodes they grew up with, and slowly building an entire separate layer of meaning on top of a cartoon that was never designed to carry it. None of what follows in this section comes from anything Steven Hillenburg or any other writer on the show has confirmed as intentional. This is fan theory territory, built out of Reddit threads, YouTube videos, and viral social media posts, and treating any of it as confirmed fact would be dishonest. What makes it worth covering is not whether any of it is true. What makes it worth covering is how widespread these ideas became, and what that says about how badly some viewers wanted this cheerful show to be hiding something darker underneath. The first and probably oldest of these theories involves the very ground Bikini Bottom sits on. A large number of fans over the years have pointed out that the name of the show's setting sounds almost identical to a real place, a location called Bikini Atoll, a real group of islands in the Pacific Ocean. Bikini Atoll is not a made-up name invented for this show. It is an actual location where the United States government conducted a large number of nuclear weapons tests throughout the 1940s and 1950s, dropping powerful bombs into the surrounding water and radically changing the environment in that part of the ocean for years afterward. Once fans made this connection between the fictional Bikini Bottom and the real Bikini Atoll, a theory started spreading that treats this shared name as more than just a coincidence or a simple pun. According to this theory, every strange, oddly shaped, brightly colored sea creature living in Bikini Bottom exists the way they do because of radiation exposure from those real nuclear tests. Under this reading, SpongeBob himself, along with Patrick, Squidward, and everyone else, would technically be some kind of mutated creature, their exaggerated personalities and unusual appearances explained as side effects of growing up in a part of the ocean permanently changed by nuclear fallout. This theory has never been confirmed by anyone connected to the actual show. Steven Hillenburg's own public explanations for how he built this world focus entirely on his background as a marine science teacher and his interest in creating a colorful, playful setting loosely inspired by real ocean life, never once mentioning nuclear history as part of his actual creative process. The theory survives anyway, repeated constantly across fan videos and online lists of dark SpongeBob theories, mostly because the coincidence between the two names is real and easy to notice, even if nothing beyond that coincidence has ever been confirmed as intentional. A second theory, arguably even more widely repeated than the nuclear testing idea, involves reading every major character in the show as a stand-in for one of the 7 deadly sins, a very old religious concept describing 7 specific behaviors traditionally viewed as especially destructive. Fans have spent years online building and rebuilding slightly different versions of this exact comparison, and while the specific pairings shift depending on who is making the argument, certain matches show up again and again across nearly every version of the theory. SpongeBob himself usually gets connected to lust in these theories, though almost every single person making this argument is quick to clarify they do not mean lust in a romantic or sexual sense. Instead, they describe it as an overwhelming, almost excessive desire, applied to SpongeBob's constant need for approval and his intense eagerness to please absolutely everyone around him at all times. Patrick almost universally gets assigned to sloth, connected directly to his well-established laziness and his complete lack of any real ambition or goal beyond doing as little as possible. Squidward, in the vast majority of versions of this theory, gets connected to wrath, tied to his constant frustration, his short temper, and his near-constant anger directed at SpongeBob specifically. Mr. Krabs gets connected to greed in essentially every single version of this theory, without exception, which makes sense given everything already covered in this video about his relationship with money. theory. Plankton, in most versions, gets tied to envy, connected directly to his endless jealousy over Krabs' success and his repeated attempts to steal something that already belongs to somebody else. The remaining sins, gluttony and pride, get assigned less consistently depending on which version of the theory a person is looking at, sometimes going to Sandy for her competitive nature and confidence in her own abilities, sometimes going to Gary for his constant eating, and sometimes going to other side characters, depending on which specific version of the list someone happens to be reading. This particular theory has spread widely enough that it shows up across multiple separate websites, video essays, and social media posts, often presented with slightly different character assignments, but built around the exact same basic structure every single time. Nothing about this theory has ever been confirmed by anyone who actually worked on the show. It appears to be something fans built entirely on their own, drawn purely from noticing that the personalities of the show's main cast happen to line up reasonably well with 7 very old and very well-known personality categories that most people already recognize from religious or cultural education. Several writers covering this theory have specifically noted that reducing an entire character down to a single sin oversimplifies what these characters actually are, but the theory keeps getting repeated anyway, simply because the comparison is easy to make and easy to remember. A separate and much stranger theory that circulated for years among fans involves the idea that each major character represents a different kind of drug, with their personalities and behaviors explained as symptoms of whatever substance they are supposedly under the influence of. Under different versions of this theory, SpongeBob's constant hyperactive energy and his tendency to imagine wild, distorted realities gets connected to stimulant drugs or to hallucinogenic mushrooms, depending on which specific version a person happens to encounter. Patrick's extreme laziness and slow, foggy way of thinking gets connected to marijuana in most versions of this theory. Squidward's constant low mood, isolation, and general exhaustion with life gets connected to depressant drugs like heroin in some versions of the theory, while Mr. Krabs sometimes gets cast as the person supplying everyone with whatever substance they are supposedly using, based purely on his role as the group's boss and authority figure. This particular theory has drawn more criticism and pushback than most of the others on this list, even among fans who enjoy dark theory content in general. Multiple people writing about this theory over the years have pointed out that reducing every character's personality down to a supposed drug addiction removes the actual creativity and imagination that makes these characters interesting in the first place. The characters were never shown taking any actual substances anywhere in the show, and the entire theory rests purely on comparing exaggerated cartoon behavior to commonly known drug side effects, without any actual evidence from the show itself supporting the comparison beyond surface-level similarity. A related but separate theory, one that grew dramatically in popularity through a specific viral video that spread across the platform TikTok, takes a completely different approach to reading the cast, connecting each major character not to a sin or a drug, but to a specific mental health condition. This particular version of the theory reportedly reached close to 30 million views, according to reporting that tracked its spread online, making it one of the most widely seen pieces of SpongeBob theory content ever produced. Under this specific viral theory, SpongeBob himself gets connected to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder based on his constant high energy, his difficulty focusing on anything for very long, and his tendency to jump quickly between different thoughts and activities. Patrick, in this version of the theory, gets connected to an intellectual disability based on his general difficulty processing information and his frequent confusion about very basic concepts other characters understand easily. Squidward gets connected to depression in nearly every version of this theory, a connection that lines up directly with everything already covered earlier in this video about the specific episode built around his own extended depressive episode. Sandy, in some versions of this theory, gets connected to a mood disorder involving unpredictable emotional swings, based on her occasional bursts of extreme confidence, followed by frustration when things do not go her way. Mr. Krabs gets connected in various versions to either a narcissistic personality, based on his self-centered focus on money and status, or to an obsessive-compulsive pattern, based on his constant fixation on protecting and growing his wealth, no matter what else is happening around him. Plankton, in several versions, gets connected to narcissistic or antisocial personality patterns, tied to his manipulative schemes and his complete disregard for how his actions affect Mr. Krabs or anyone else standing in his way. Reality reaction to this specific viral theory split fairly sharply once it spread widely enough to reach a large general audience, rather than just dedicated fan communities already interested in this kind of content. Comment sections responding to the viral video, according to reporting that covered the trend directly, showed people reacting in very different directions. Some viewers expressed genuine surprise, saying the comparison made complete sense once they thought about it, and claiming it changed how they saw the show going forward. Other viewers pushed back hard against the entire idea, specifically questioning why people felt the need to search for hidden mental illness inside a children's cartoon at all, with some directly suggesting the whole exercise amounted to overthinking a simple kids show far beyond what it was ever meant to carry. This particular reaction split matters for understanding this theory correctly. Attaching real mental health conditions to fictional cartoon characters is not the same thing as an actual clinical diagnosis, and treating it that way misunderstands both the theory and the conditions themselves. Real conditions like depression, attention difficulties, or mood disorders involve complicated individual experiences that look different from person to person, and they cannot be accurately summed up by comparing someone to a single cartoon character's personality traits. What this theory actually represents is something different and arguably more interesting than a diagnosis. It represents an example of how audiences use familiar fictional characters as an easy, shared reference point for describing real feelings and real experiences, reaching for a character everyone already knows as a shortcut for describing something that might otherwise be hard to put into words. The theory spreading as widely as it did says something true about how recognizable Squidward's exhaustion or SpongeBob's energy feel to real viewers, even if the theory itself should never be mistaken for anything resembling an actual professional evaluation of a fictional character. A separate and specifically referenced piece of evidence that fans of this mental health theory often point back to is the episode Rock Bottom, which comes from the show's very first season. The basic plot follows SpongeBob and Patrick riding a bus home after a day at an amusement park. Through a strange turn of events, SpongeBob accidentally ends up on the wrong bus, alone, taken to an unfamiliar, dark, and unsettling place called Rock Bottom, filled with strange, mostly silent creatures who speak a language SpongeBob cannot understand at all. He spends the rest of the episode trying desperately to find his way home, missing bus after bus due to a series of frustrating obstacles, growing more visibly panicked and anxious as the episode goes on. The tone of this episode stands apart clearly from most of the show's other early episodes. Rather than the bright, colorful, chaotic energy that defines most of Bikini Bottom, Rock Bottom is shown as dim, quiet, and genuinely unsettling, populated by characters who ignore SpongeBob or actively make his situation worse rather than helping him. Fans who point to this episode as evidence supporting mental health readings of the show describe SpongeBob's growing panic, his inability to communicate with anyone around him, and his mounting sense that he might be stuck in this place forever as something that closely resembles real anxiety, specifically the experience of feeling trapped, unheard, and unable to escape a situation that keeps getting worse no matter what he tries. This reading treats the episode as an early example of the show tapping into genuine emotional territory, well before later episodes like the one built around Squidward's depression pushed even further in that same direction. Moving away from theories built around mental health or hidden substances entirely, one of the most enduring and widely repeated dark theories about this show involves a much simpler and stranger question, focused entirely on why SpongeBob seems to never age, never permanently suffer any lasting injury, and never actually change, no matter how many wild and often violent situations he survives across hundreds of episodes. This observation has led a significant number of fans over the years to a theory suggesting that SpongeBob might be trapped inside some kind of purgatory, an idea borrowed from religious concepts describing a place where a soul remains stuck, repeating the same experience over and over without ever truly moving forward or reaching any kind of final resting place. Under this theory, SpongeBob's relentless, unshakable cheerfulness gets reinterpreted not as genuine happiness, but as a kind of forced or automatic optimism, something he clings to specifically because the alternative, acknowledging that he might be stuck reliving the same daily routine at the Krusty Krab forever with no real escape, would be too painful to face directly. Fans supporting this theory point to the sheer number of times SpongeBob survives explosions, falls, and other disasters disasters completely unharmed, along with the fact that his life essentially resets at the start of nearly every single episode, regardless of what happened the episode before, as evidence supporting the idea that something about his existence does not follow normal rules the way a real, mortal life would. This theory has never been confirmed by anyone connected to the actual production of the show, and it runs directly against one of the most basic and common features of nearly all long-running animated sitcoms, a pattern generally called negative continuity, where a show intentionally resets its characters and their circumstances at the start of each new episode, specifically so viewers can watch episodes in any order without needing to track ongoing storylines. Shows built this way are not doing anything unusual or sinister by resetting their characters. They are simply using an extremely common structural choice that makes a long-running series easier to produce and easier for casual viewers to jump into at any point. The purgatory theory takes this completely ordinary structural choice and reinterprets it as something much darker, an interesting piece of internet folklore built entirely on top of a production decision that has nothing inherently mysterious about it at all. A related theory, specifically targeting Squidward rather than SpongeBob, offers a very different explanation for one of the show's more curious ongoing details, namely the question of why Squidward, despite clearly hating his neighbors, hating his job, and expressing constant frustration with his entire life, never simply moves away or quits his job at the Krusty Krab across more than 2 decades of episodes. This theory suggests that Squidward may be serving as some kind of secret guardian for SpongeBob, connected somehow to SpongeBob's actual parents, possibly explaining why SpongeBob apparently never needs to worry about money for his own home, despite earning almost nothing at his job. One specific version of this theory, shared originally on the online platform Reddit by a user going by the name DirtSpeep, proposes a detailed backstory to support this idea. According to this specific version, Squidward may have once belonged to a wealthier social circle before some kind of failure, possibly connected to his musical ambitions, caused him to fall out of that world entirely. Under this theory, SpongeBob's own parents, aware of Squidward's situation, may have reached out to help him get back on his feet financially, purchasing him the house he lives in next to SpongeBob, specifically in exchange for keeping a watchful eye on their son. This would explain, under the theory, why Squidward stays in the same house next to a neighbor he constantly complains about for years and years, without ever actually leaving, and why SpongeBob never appears to worry about affording his own home, despite his extremely low income at the Krusty Krab. Like most of the theories covered in this section, this idea has never been confirmed anywhere in the actual show, and it requires connecting several separate pieces of the show's history in a way the writers have never directly supported. It remains a piece of fan speculation built specifically to explain a small, mostly overlooked detail about the show's setup, namely, why 2 characters who clearly do not get along continue living directly next to each other for the show's entire run without any explanation ever being given on screen. A separate theory involving Patrick takes his character in the opposite direction from most of the others on this list. Rather than assigning him some kind of hidden struggle or condition, this theory proposes that Patrick's constant confusion and slow way of processing information is actually a performance, an act he deliberately puts on while secretly being one of the most intelligent characters in the entire show. Fans supporting this theory point to a small number of specific episodes across the show's run, where Patrick briefly demonstrates surprising knowledge or clever problem-solving abilities that seem to directly contradict his usual established personality, treating these moments as evidence that his usual dim-witted behavior might be some kind of extended, deliberate disguise rather than his true nature. This theory has drawn some pushback from fans, who point out that these occasional moments of unexpected competence are far more likely simple writing inconsistencies, common in any long-running show with many different writers contributing scripts across more than 2 decades, rather than any intentional secret buried inside the character. Long-running animated shows frequently show minor inconsistencies in character intelligence or ability, depending on what a specific episode's plot requires, and treating every one of these small inconsistencies as evidence of some grand hidden secret requires overlooking a much simpler and more common explanation. One final theory worth covering involves Gary, SpongeBob's pet snail, who has been part of the show since its very first episode. A theory shared among some fans over the years suggests that Gary might not actually exist as a real creature within the world of the show at all, proposing instead that he he could be some kind of imaginary companion that only SpongeBob can actually see and interact with in a meaningful way. This particular theory tends to be one of the least widely supported on this entire list, since Gary interacts directly and consistently with multiple other characters across many different episodes throughout the show's run, including characters who clearly see, hear, and respond to him the same way they would respond to any other established character in the world of Bikini Bottom. This kind of consistent interaction across many different episodes and many different characters makes the imaginary companion theory difficult to support compared to some of the other ideas covered in this section, and it tends to get mentioned mostly as a curiosity rather than something taken especially seriously even within fan communities that generally enjoy this kind of dark theory content. Taken all together, this collection of fan theories spanning purgatory, nuclear radiation, hidden mental health conditions, secret drug use, ancient religious sin categories, secret guardianship arrangements, and hidden genius tells a story less about the actual show itself and more about the specific relationship a huge number of people have developed with it over more than 2 decades. This is not a show most adult viewers simply watched once as children and moved on from entirely. It is a show a massive number of people kept coming back to, rewatching as adults, picking apart frame by frame, and using as a canvas for building elaborate explanations for even the smallest unexplained details. Whether that means one character's unexplained wealth, another character's unusual laziness, or a setting whose name happens to match a real place with a genuinely dark history attached to it. None of these theories represent anything close to confirmed fact. Stephen Hillenburg's own explanations for creating this world focus consistently and specifically on his background studying marine biology and his desire to build something colorful, playful, and rooted in genuine curiosity about ocean life, not on any interest in secretly encoding nuclear history, religious sin categories, or clinical mental health conditions into a children's cartoon. The writers who worked on the show across its many seasons have generally described their process in similarly straightforward terms, focused on finding what makes a scene funny or what serves a specific character's established personality, rather than building secret layers of meaning intended for future generations of internet detectives to eventually uncover. What makes this collection of theories worth covering anyway is not whether any single one holds up under close scrutiny. What makes it worth covering is the sheer scale of it. The fact that a show built primarily to make children laugh generated enough genuine curiosity, enough repeated rewatching, and enough emotional attachment from its audience that people kept searching for something deeper inside it for years and years after it first aired, long after most of them had grown into adults, with no particular reason to still be thinking about a cartoon sponge at all. Real, confirmed dark content already exists inside this show in significant amounts, covered in detail across every earlier section of this video, from actual network bans to an actual episode built around a suicide attempt, to actual academic papers treating a fast food restaurant as a serious case study in economic theory. The fan theory layer, covered in this section, sits on top of all of that confirmed material, built by an audience that clearly wanted there to be even more going on beneath the surface than what had already been proven true, filling in every remaining gap and every remaining unanswered question with whatever explanation felt most compelling, whether or not the show itself ever actually supported it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That gap between what this show actually, provably contains and what generations of viewers have imagined or projected onto it says something worth sitting with as this whole examination comes to a close. Something that connects every piece of this video back to a single, simple truth about the man who built this entire world in the first place, and what he actually said in his own words about what he was trying to create. Section 10. The man who actually built this world and what he said about it. 9 sections of this video have covered real bans, real network decisions, real news controversies, real academic papers, and thousands of fan theories built built by people who wanted a children's cartoon to be hiding something bigger underneath its cheerful surface. None of that material means anything without looking at the one person whose actual intentions matter more than anyone else's when it comes to understanding what this show was originally supposed to be. That person is Stephen Hillenburg, the man who created SpongeBob SquarePants, and looking closely at his own life and his own words about the show tells a story that sits in sharp contrast with almost everything covered so far in this video. Stephen Hillenburg was not originally a television writer or a cartoon artist by training. Before he ever created a single episode of this show, he worked as a marine science educator, someone who taught people about ocean life for a living. He studied marine biology in college and spent time working at a place called the Ocean Institute, teaching both children and adults about the animals and ecosystems that exist underwater. This background is not a small detail or a fun fact detached from the show itself. It shaped almost every single creative decision that went into building the world of Bikini Bottom from the ground up. Long before SpongeBob SquarePants existed as a television show, Hillenburg had already spent years thinking carefully about how to make ocean life interesting and understandable to people who had never studied it themselves. While working at the Ocean Institute, he created an educational comic book called The Intertidal Zone, specifically to help teach people about the different creatures living in tide pools along the coast. This comic gave many of the animals in it their own personalities and small storylines, an early creative decision that lines up directly with characters he would later build for his television show. A sponge character, a starfish character, and other sea creatures all appeared in this early educational project, years before any of them evolved into the versions audiences know today. This detail matters because it shows that Hillenburg's interest in personifying ocean animals came directly out of his work as a teacher, built specifically to help people learn and engage with real marine biology, not out of any interest in building hidden dark commentary into future entertainment. When Hillenburg eventually moved away from teaching and into animation, taking jobs at other studios before eventually creating his own show, he carried this same basic goal forward with him. Every interview he gave over the years about why he created SpongeBob SquarePants circles back to the same explanation. He wanted to build a colorful, playful, and genuinely fun world for kids, rooted in his own real affection for ocean life and his own memories of childhood curiosity about the sea. He has talked about growing up fascinated by tide pools and ocean creatures himself, and has described wanting to bring some of that same sense of wonder and simple joy to a new generation of kids watching his show. Nothing in any of his public interviews, going back through the entire history of the show, ever mentions building intentional commentary about capitalism, mental illness, nuclear history, or workplace exploitation into any of the show's episodes. When asked directly about the show's appeal and its meaning over the years, Hillenburg consistently focused on much simpler ideas, things like wanting to make people laugh, wanting to create characters kids could relate to and enjoy spending time with, and wanting the show to work as pure entertainment first and foremost, rather than as any kind of message delivery system hidden inside a cartoon. This does not mean every single writer who ever worked on the show across its more than 2 decades of episodes shared this exact same mindset in every single script they wrote. A show running this long involves dozens of different writers contributing scripts across many different seasons, each bringing their own personal sense of humor, their own interests, and their own creative instincts to individual episodes. Some of the darker material covered earlier in this video, particularly episodes from later seasons, like One Course Meal or Are You Happy Now, came from a different era of the show's production, involving different writers working under different creative leadership than the earliest seasons Hillenburg oversaw most closely himself. This distinction matters for understanding the show's full history accurately. Hillenburg served as the show's original creator and its primary creative force during its earliest and most celebrated seasons, generally considered to run through the show's original theatrical movie release in 2004. After this point, he stepped back from direct daily involvement with the series for a period of time, allowing other writers and producers to take over primary creative control while he pursued other projects. He eventually returned to a more active advisory role on the show later on, but the middle stretch of the show's history, including many of the specific episodes discussed throughout this video as its darkest and most controversial entries, were produced during a period when Hillenburg himself was not the primary creative voice shaping every script. This helps explain something that might otherwise seem confusing about how a single show could contain both an early season built around gentle, gorgeous storytelling like Band Geeks, a story genuinely about earned artistic triumph, and a later season episode built around a character's suicide attempt played for uncomfortable laughter. Different people were making different creative decisions at different points across the show's run, working under different standards, different creative pressures, and different ideas about what kind of humor the show should be reaching for at any given moment. The show's tone was never perfectly consistent across its entire history, because the people actually writing it were never exactly the same group of people for more than 20 years straight. Understanding this also reframes something covered earlier in this video in a genuinely important way. The fan theory suggesting SpongeBob might be trapped in some kind of endless purgatory, forced to relive the same day over and over without ever aging or changing, was always presented earlier in this video as pure fan speculation, with no basis in anything the show's creators ever confirmed. That remains true, but there is a real, documented, and genuinely difficult piece of history connected to Hillenburg himself that puts questions about permanence, time, and mortality in a completely different light, one that has nothing to do with fan theory and everything to do with what actually happened to the man who built this entire world. In March of 2017, Steven Hillenburg publicly announced that he had been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, a serious disease that gradually affects a person's muscles and physical abilities over time. This is a real medical diagnosis, publicly confirmed by Hillenburg himself and reported widely across major news outlets at the time. He made this announcement specifically because the disease had already begun affecting his ability to work, and he wanted to be honest about his condition, rather than letting rumors or unclear explanations spread about his declining health. Despite this diagnosis, Hillenburg made a specific and clear decision about how he wanted to spend whatever time and ability he had left. According to reporting from the time of his announcement, he stated his intention to remain involved with the show and its franchise for as long as he was physically able to do so, continuing to work on new SpongeBob content even after receiving this diagnosis. This detail matters because it shows a real person choosing to keep creating within the world he built, right up until his own body made that impossible, rather than simply stepping away the moment things became difficult. Steven Hillenburg passed away on November 26, 2018, roughly a year and a half after his initial diagnosis. His death was confirmed publicly and reported across major news organizations worldwide, with tributes pouring in from fans, animators, and public figures who had grown up watching or working on the show he created. He was 57 years old at the time of his death. Placing this real history next to the fan theory about SpongeBob existing in some kind of frozen, unchanging purgatory creates a genuinely strange and somewhat sad contrast worth sitting with directly. The fictional character has continued existing exactly as he always did, cheerful, unchanging, and seemingly untouched by time, appearing in new episodes, new movies, and new merchandise for years after his creator's actual death. The real man responsible for imagining this entire, endlessly cheerful, endlessly consistent world experienced something that fictional character never has to face at all. A real illness that changed his body over time, followed by a real ending that no amount of writing or animation could undo or reset. This is not being pointed out to suggest Hillenburg intended his show to carry some kind of secret meditation on mortality, since nothing in his own explanations of the show ever supports that reading. It is being pointed out because it captures something honest about the difference between fiction and the people who create it. A cartoon character can survive endless explosions, endless falls, and endless disasters without ever aging a single day, existing in a permanent, cheerful present that never has to change no matter how many seasons pass. The actual human being who dreamed up that character does not get to live by those same rules, and Hillenburg's real diagnosis and real death stand as a genuinely serious reminder of that gap between the immortal, unchanging world he built and the mortal, limited life he actually lived while building it. Since Hillenburg's death, the show has continued production, with new episodes, spin-off series, and additional movies released under different creative leadership carrying his original vision forward. This continuation itself reflects something Hillenburg apparently wanted, based on statements from people who worked closely with him and from the studio itself following his passing, treating the show's continued existence as a way of honoring what he built, rather than simply ending everything the moment its original creator was no longer able to personally guide it. Bringing this back around down to everything covered throughout the rest of this video, a clear and important gap emerges between what this show was originally built to be and what it eventually became once you account for its entire history, its full list of writers, and the entire audience response it generated over more than 2 decades. Hillenburg built a show rooted in genuine warmth, genuine curiosity about ocean life, and a genuine desire to make people laugh, drawing directly from his own background as a science teacher who loved sharing his knowledge of the sea with anyone willing to listen. That original vision produced some of the show's most beloved and enduring moments, including the genuinely earned triumph of band geeks and the simple, colorful charm that defined the show's earliest and most consistently praised seasons. At the same time, a show running for more than 20 years, passing through the hands of dozens of different writers, operating under constantly shifting standards about what counts as appropriate for children, and existing during an era when internet culture developed an enormous appetite for finding hidden darkness inside familiar childhood media, was never going to stay contained within that original, simple vision forever. Real episodes got written that pushed into genuinely uncomfortable territory, sometimes intentionally exploring darker comedic ground, and sometimes seemingly stumbling into serious subject matter without fully realizing the weight of what was being put on screen. Real network decisions got made, pulling specific episodes either permanently or temporarily. Once specific content crossed a line someone in a position of authority decided needed to be enforced. Real academic attention followed, as people trained to study serious literature and film turned their focus toward a cartoon restaurant and found more consistent, detailed material than anyone might have expected going in. Real fans, watching and rewatching this show across their own childhoods and into their own adult lives, built an entire additional universe of theories and interpretations on top of all of this confirmed material, filling every unanswered question and every strange, unexplained detail with whatever explanation felt most satisfying, whether or not the show's actual creators ever intended or confirmed any of it. None of these different layers cancel each other out. All of them are true at the same time, existing together inside the same 20-plus year history of a single television show. Steven Hillenburg really did build this world out of genuine love for the ocean and genuine warmth toward the audience he was trying to entertain. The show really did also produce a permanently banned episode, a suicide attempt played for uncomfortable laughter, an accidental collision with real national politics, a full episode depicting something close to clinical depression, published academic papers treating a fast food restaurant as a serious economic case study, and thousands of fan theories built by an audience desperate to find something deeper, hiding underneath all that surface-level cheerfulness. Every single one of these things happened within the same 20-plus years, under the same show title, featuring the same characters, singing the same theme song at the start of every single episode. What ties all of this together, more than any single episode or any single controversy covered throughout this entire video, is a simple observation about what happens when something is allowed to exist for a very long time in front of a very large and very attentive audience. A show that had only lasted 2 or 3 seasons before ending would never have generated this much material to examine. It would not have had time to drift through different creative teams, different cultural moments, and different standards of acceptability. It would not have accumulated more than 20 years worth of individual choices made by dozens of different people, occasionally lining up into patterns nobody specifically planned, but that became impossible to ignore once enough episodes existed to reveal them clearly. SpongeBob SquarePants got that time. It became one of the longest-running, most widely watched animated shows ever produced, translated into dozens of languages and broadcast in countries around the entire world, watched by children who grew into teenagers, who grew into adults, some of whom kept re-watching the exact same episodes well into their 30s and 40s, noticing new details every single time they returned to something they thought they already knew completely. That length of time and that scale of audience attention created the exact conditions needed for everything covered throughout this video to happen. A show that runs long enough, watched by enough different people across enough different stages of their own lives, eventually reveals every possible layer buried inside it, the ones its creator intended and the ones nobody intended at all, the confirmed dark history and the pure speculation built entirely by an audience audience determined to keep finding something new, no matter how many times they had already watched the exact same episode before. Steven Hillenburg built a sponge who lives in a pineapple under the sea, worked at a restaurant flipping patties, and loved his simple, repetitive life with a kind of pure, uncomplicated joy that very few fictional characters have ever managed to sustain for this long without becoming boring or predictable. He built that character out of real affection for the ocean and real desire to make people laugh, drawing on years spent teaching others about marine life before he ever picked up a pen to draw his first cartoon fish. Everything else this show eventually became, every ban, every controversy, every academic paper, and every strange theory built by fans refusing to accept that a cartoon could simply be exactly what it appears to be on the surface, grew up around that original, simple idea over more than 20 years, one episode, one writer, and one viewer at a time. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.